Monarchy requires the appearance of perfection, bloodlines untainted by weakness, families free from the disabilities and mental illnesses that visit everyone else. When reality fails to cooperate, when children are born with conditions that contradict this mythology or relatives develop illnesses that suggest genetic imperfection, royal families face a choice: acknowledge the truth or make the problem disappear. Wealth makes disappearance possible. Private institutions where relatives can be housed indefinitely. Country estates converted to facilities where family members live under medical supervision but beyond public knowledge. Staff who understand that silence is a condition of employment, enforced by contracts carrying penalties severe enough to guarantee compliance. Records that are sealed, altered, or destroyed entirely to eliminate evidence that certain relatives ever existed. The relatives hidden this way spent years or decades in comfortable prisons, denied not freedom exactly, but acknowledgement. Their names removed from family trees, their photographs excluded from official portraits, their very existence a secret, maintained by people paid to forget they'd ever met them. Today we examine how the royal family buried scandal in country houses, and whether the relatives they hid ever understood why their own families had erased them. In June 1941, 5 women were driven through the Surrey countryside and deposited inside the iron-gated walls of the Royal Earlswood Hospital for mental defectives in Redhill. 2 of them, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, were the first cousins of the girl who would become Queen Elizabeth II. They would not be seen by most of the outside world for the rest of their lives. By 1963, they had both been officially declared dead. The truth did not emerge until April 1987, when a tabloid reporter from The Sun, posed as a relative, walked into the hospital's common room and photographed a frail, 61-year-old woman staring blankly ahead. That woman was Catherine Bowes-Lyon, and she had been listed as dead in the genealogical Bible of British aristocracy for 26 years. Her sister Nerissa had died the previous year, buried in a pauper's grave, marked by a plastic tag and a serial number, with no family present at the funeral. According to Burke's peerage, Nerissa had technically been dead since 1940. What unfolded over the following days, months and years was one of the most disturbing stories of concealment, institutional neglect and aristocratic shame in modern British royal history. A story bound up in the eugenics movement, the fragility of the monarchy's hereditary principle, the legal machinery of the Mental Deficiency Act, and the century-long brutality of the Victorian asylum system. It is also a story that is still being debated, disputed and reassessed today. Today we walk through the wards, the records and the silence that kept 2 women invisible for 46 years, while the family that erased them became the most famous household on earth. The Reverend Andrew Reed had already founded 3 orphan charities and the Royal Hospital for Incurables by the time he turned his attention, in 1847, to the question of what Britain was doing with its intellectually disabled citizens. The answer, as Reed discovered, was very little that could be described as civilised. An 1848 estimate suggested that of 33,000 inmates in English and Welsh asylums, only 14,000 were actually lunatics in any meaningful clinical sense. The remainder were people with intellectual disabilities, housed alongside the genuinely mentally ill for want of anywhere else to put them, or consigned to workhouses alongside the destitute poor, where conditions were designed to discourage habitation rather than support it. Reed's proposal was reformist and, by the standards of the era, radical. A dedicated facility for people with intellectual disabilities, one that would educate rather than contain, train rather than warehouse, preparing its residents, as Reed wrote, as much as possible for the duties and enjoyments of life. 155 acres of land were purchased at Earlswood Common, near Redhill in Surrey, a location whose rural tranquillity was considered therapeutically advantageous and whose distance from central London was considered socially convenient, the 2 priorities that would define institutional siting in England for the next century. Prince Albert laid the foundation stone in June 1853, with the ceremonial confidence of a man whose faith in progressive institutional design had not yet been tested by the institutions themselves. He returned to officially open the asylum in June 1855, by which point the architect William Bonathan Moffat had produced a building that looked considerably more like a country estate than a place of medical confinement. Red brick with bath stone dressings, Tudor Gothic towers, sweeping grounds. The entire composition announcing that the people inside were being improved rather than punished. A distinction the Victorian establishment considered morally significant and practically achievable. Before the first medical superintendent arrived, however, a commission of inspection discovered conditions that bore no relationship to the founding rhetoric. Dehumanizing punishments, unsanitary wards, overcrowding, rampant tuberculosis, and a mortality rate that suggested the building was rather more effective at ending lives than at improving them. The Commission resolved to reform from the top and appointed Dr. John Langdon Down as medical superintendent in 1855. Down was 27 years old, a physician of unusual intelligence and genuine compassion, and within a year he had transformed the institution into something approaching the vision Reed had originally described. He introduced activities, crafts, piano lessons, diction classes, and what would today be called occupational therapy, the manufacturing of boots, bonnets and baskets, the kind of structured engagement that gave residents identifiable skills, identifiable days, and the experience of having done something with their hands that existed in the world after they put it down. Under Down's supervision, Earlswood became, briefly, a model of humane institutional care, a place where the residents were treated as people capable of development rather than bodies requiring management, a distinction that sounds obvious now, but that the vast majority of Britain's institutional infrastructure had not yet grasped and would not grasp for another century. He would later identify and describe the genetic condition that still carries his name, which gives some indication of the calibre of mind the institution briefly attracted when it was still young enough to believe in its own ideals. Down resigned in 1868 to found his own, smaller asylum at Normansfield in Teddington, specifically for upper-class patients who could pay fees that reflected the quality of care he intended to provide, which tells you something about what he understood the future of publicly funded care to be. After his departure, the institutional pressures that defeated every Victorian reformer began their familiar work. Populations grew as local authorities discovered a convenient place to deposit inconvenient people. Funding contracted as public enthusiasm for reform gave way to public indifference toward the reformed. Overcrowding worsened, staff levels fell, and the idealism of the founding years gave way to the grim administrative routine of managing large numbers of people who could not leave in a building that had not been designed for the numbers it now held, maintained by a bureaucracy whose primary concern was order rather than enrichment. The pattern was not unique to Earlswood, it was the standard trajectory of every large Victorian asylum in Britain, a trajectory in which progressive founding intentions were progressively defeated by the economics of scale and the politics of neglect. By the early 20th century, the institution had been absorbed into the broader architecture of the British state's approach to what it called mental deficiency, and the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913 had given that architecture the force of law. The Act, a piece of legislation shaped directly by the eugenics movement, then sweeping the English-speaking world, established legal categories of idiot, imbecile, feeble-minded and moral defective, and it authorised the indefinite detention of anyone classified under these headings without trial, without treatment, and without any meaningful process of appeal. People classified under the Act could be locked in a mental deficiency colony without having committed any crime and without being diagnosed with a treatable illness, which meant that the distinction between hospital and prison was, for the people inside, largely academic. By the late 1940s, the National Council for Civil Liberties reported that 50,000 people were detained under the Act, and that 30% of them had already spent between 10 and 20 years inside. The Act remained on the books until it was repealed by the Mental Health Act of 1959, though people detained under its provisions were still being discovered in institutions as late as the 1990s. The asylum was renamed the Royal Earlswood Institution for Mental Defectives in June 1926, a title that captures the era's clinical brutalism with an efficiency the institution itself might have admired. When two young women named Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon arrived at its gates in June 1941, the building that Prince Albert had opened 86 years earlier had become precisely the kind of place Andrew Reed had set out to make unnecessary. The Bowes-Lyon family had been minor Scottish aristocrats for generations, part of the landed gentry that formed the social fabric of Edwardian Britain without troubling its headlines. They were respectable, propertied, and entirely peripheral to the story of the British monarchy, which suited a family whose seat at Glamis Castle in Angus suggested inherited consequence without demanding inherited attention. That arrangement ended on April 26, 1923, when Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon married Prince Albert, Duke of York, the second son of King George V, and a man whose stammer and retiring temperament had placed him comfortably distant from the succession and from the public scrutiny that accompanied it. Nobody expected Albert to become king, and nobody expected his wife's family to become the most closely examined in-laws in the empire, and the degree to which both expectations would be overturned within 13 years would reshape the Bowes-Lyon family's relationship to its own history in ways that were permanent and, for certain of its members, fatal. When Edward VIII abdicated in December 1936 and Albert was crowned King George VI, Elizabeth became Queen Consort, and the Bowes-Lyon vaulted from peripheral aristocracy to the innermost circle of the British throne in a single constitutional spasm that nobody in the family had anticipated and that everyone in the family was now required to sustain. The abdication had severely shaken public confidence in the monarchy as an institution. One king had walked away from the throne for a woman the establishment considered unsuitable, and the resulting constitutional crisis had exposed with uncomfortable clarity how fragile the hereditary principle actually was, when the hereditary candidate decided he had better things to do. King George VI and his wife responded with a sustained public performance of patriotic duty that the press of the era found inspiring, and that the monarchy of the era found essential, remaining at Buckingham Palace during the Blitz, visiting bombed-out neighbourhoods with the practised composure of a couple who understood that the institution's survival depended on being seen to share the country's suffering, building a narrative of stability and moral authority around the Crown, at precisely the moment when the Crown's claim to both was most vulnerable. The Queen Mother, as she would later be known, was the central figure in this performance. Warm, visible, apparently unafraid, dressed in pastel colours because she believed the bombed-out families she visited deserved to see something other than mourning black, and projecting an image of approachable royal decency that would sustain her public reputation for the next 60 years. Every aspect of that image depended on the family appearing united, healthy, and genetically sound, which made any deviation from that appearance a matter of institutional as well as personal concern. The family that had married into this arrangement was now subject to a level of scrutiny that the Bowes-Lyons had never previously experienced and were not, in all respects, prepared for. The Queen Mother had 9 siblings. One of them was John Herbert Bowes-Lyon, born in 1886, the second son of Claude Bowes-Lyon, 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. John was close to his sister Elizabeth, and his family was woven into the broader social fabric of the Bowes-Lyon household at Glamis, with the comfortable proximity of a large aristocratic clan that had not yet learned to regard proximity as a liability. He died young enough and quietly enough to avoid the questions that would later engulf his children, and the family's memory of him remained uncomplicated in a way that nothing else about this story would be. He married Fenella Hepburn Stuart Forbes Trefusis, a woman whose surname alone suggested the kind of aristocratic genealogical complexity that requires a diagram rather than a sentence, and the daughter of Charles Hepburn's Stuart Forbes Trefusis, 21st Baron Clinton. The couple had 5 daughters. Their first, Patricia, died in infancy in 1917. Anne, born in 1917, would go on to marry into Danish royalty and live a conventional aristocratic life. Diana, born in 1923, followed a similarly conventional path. And then there were the 2 who would become the centre of this story. Nerissa Jane Irene Bowes-Lyon, born February 18, 1919, and Catherine Juliette Bowes-Lyon, born July 4, 1926. Catherine arrived 3 months after her first cousin, the future Queen Elizabeth II, a biographical coincidence that only acquires its full weight when the lives that follow diverge so completely that the coincidence ceases to feel accidental and begins to feel like an accusation. Both Nerissa and Catherine were born with severe developmental disabilities. In the terminology of the era, blunt, dehumanizing, and now recognized as both clinically imprecise and morally offensive, they were classified as imbeciles, a legal and medical designation under the Mental Deficiency Act 1913, describing people with a mental age of roughly 3 to 7 years and an IQ in the range of 25 to 50. Neither Nerissa nor Catherine ever learned to speak. Nerissa's medical records at Royal Earlswood would later describe her as making unintelligible noises all the time, adding that she was very affectionate and can say a few babyish words. Catherine was entirely non-verbal. John Bowes-Lyon died on February 7, 1930, at Glamis Castle of pneumonia, at the age of 43, leaving behind his widow Fenella and 4 surviving daughters, 2 of whom required round-the-clock care and would never live independently. Fenella was now a single mother in her 40s, responsible for 2 severely disabled children in a household that ran on appearances, staff, and the social expectations of a family that had just inherited the most visible public role in the country. The care of Nerissa and Catherine fell entirely on the domestic arrangements she could maintain with the resources available to a widowed daughter-in-law of a Scottish earl, resources that were not inconsiderable by ordinary standards, but that were also not unlimited, and that were about to be tested by a war that would disrupt every assumption on which upper-class domestic life in Britain was built. The family that now surrounded the throne contained, in its immediate bloodline, 2 young women whose existence posed a question the institution of hereditary monarchy was not equipped to answer in public. The exact nature of the disability that affected Nerissa and Catherine has never been definitively established, which has not prevented decades of speculation, genetic theorizing, and at least one claim that would, if confirmed, change the story considerably. What is known with reasonable certainty is that their condition was genetic, that it was severe, and that it was not confined to a single family. When the story broke publicly in 1987, Dr. David Danks, then director of the Murdoch Children's Research Institute in Melbourne, proposed that a genetic disorder ran through the maternal line, not the Bowes-Lyons, but the Hepburn Stuart Forbes Trefusis family, the family of Fenella, the girl's mother. The theory held that Charles Trefusis, 21st Baron Clinton, whose parents had been first cousins, had produced consanguineous descendants who carried a recessive gene that, in females, produced severe intellectual disability and, in males, tended to cause death in early childhood. The consanguinity was the key. First cousin marriages concentrate recessive genes in subsequent generations, and the Trefusis line had compounded this concentration across multiple branches of the family tree, distributing a genetic inheritance that would not fully declare itself until the children and grandchildren of those marriages began to appear. The evidence was compelling and specific. All 5 women who would be institutionalized at Royal Earlswood in 1941 were daughters or granddaughters of the Hepburn Stuart Forbes Trefusis line. 3 of them were not Bowes-Lyons at all. They were the Fane sisters, Idoneia, Rosemary and Etheldreda, daughters of Fenella's sister Harriet, who had strikingly similar disabilities, and who would end up in the very same institution on the very same day, sharing the very same wards. Idoneia was 29 at the time of admission. Rosemary was 27, and Etheldreda was 19. 3 women from one family, admitted alongside 2 women from a second family, all 5 carrying the same genetic inheritance from their shared Trefusis ancestry. There was no equivalent disability anywhere in the Bose-Lyon paternal line, a detail that makes the entire subsequent history of concealment genetically illiterate as well as morally indefensible. The pattern was consistent with a sex-linked or sex-limited genetic condition. The male children of these unions tended to die young, while the female children showed intellectual disabilities of varying severity. Modern researchers have speculated that the condition may have involved a severe metabolic disorder, though no confirmed genetic diagnosis has ever been publicly established. And the precise mechanism by which the Trefusis gene expressed itself in these 5 women remains, decades after their institutionalization, an open clinical question. The reach of what one aristocratic family referred to as the Trefusis blood extended further into the British upper class than most people appreciated at the time. In the early 1950s, Anne Tennant, later Baroness Glenconner, best known in subsequent decades as Princess Margaret's close friend, was briefly engaged to Johnny Spencer, Viscount Althorp, the man who would later become the father of Princess Diana. The engagement was broken off by Johnny's father, the 7th Earl Spencer, on the explicit grounds of what he called mad blood, a direct reference to the Trefusis ancestry that Anne shared through her paternal grandmother, Marion Trefusis. The Spencers were aware of the disability pattern in the family and considered it a disqualifying hereditary taint, a judgment they arrived at without embarrassment, and communicated without apology, because the protection of a bloodline from perceived contamination was, in this social world, not cruelty, but prudence. This tells you everything you need to know about the climate in which Fenella Bose-Lyon made her decisions, and everything you need to know about the genetic ignorance that made those decisions feel rational. That such a suspicion could break an aristocratic engagement as late as the early 1950s gives some indication of the social consequences a family risked by acknowledging disability in its bloodline. Not embarrassment, not awkward conversation at country house dinners, but the concrete destruction of their children's prospects in a marriage market where bloodline was currency and genetic reputation was the collateral that secured every match. The fear of hereditary taint was not an abstract philosophical concern for families operating at this level of British society. It was a practical consideration with immediate and measurable consequences, capable of ending alliances that had been negotiated over months and severing relationships between houses that had been intermarried for generations. Lady Colin Campbell later claimed, based on a second-hand medical source, that both sisters suffered from Huntington's disease, a neurological condition that causes progressive physical and cognitive decline and typically manifests in the 2nd or 3rd decade of life, which would change the clinical picture substantially if confirmed, because Huntington's is not present from birth but develops over time, meaning the sisters might have been born with normal cognitive function and deteriorated during childhood, rather than having been disabled from the start. No independent confirmation of this claim has been established, and it remains contested by the available evidence. The cruel irony that runs through the entire story, the one that gives it its most bitter and most enduring quality, is that none of this had any bearing on the royal family's actual genetics. Queen Elizabeth II, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, and their descendants were not carriers of the Trefusis gene. The disability came entirely from Fenella's side of the family and posed absolutely no hereditary risk to any member of the royal line descended from the Queen Mother. The concealment, if it was motivated by fears of hereditary taint in the royal bloodline, was not only cruel, but founded on a complete genetic misunderstanding, a misunderstanding that a competent geneticist could have corrected at any point during the 46 years the sisters spent inside the institution. The gene they feared was not theirs to begin with. For 11 years after John Bose-Lyon's death in 1930, Fenella managed her household alone, which included the full-time care of two severely disabled daughters in an aristocratic establishment that was not designed for the purpose and that was increasingly strained by the demands of a world war. Nerissa and Catherine lived with the family, most likely at or near the Bowes-Lyon estate at Glamis Castle in Angus, Scotland, or at a family property in England. This is a period shrouded in almost total silence. No detailed accounts survive of their early life at home, their interactions with their sisters Anne and Diana, the care arrangements the family maintained, the daily reality of managing two non-verbal young women in a household structured around appearances, obligations, and the rigid social calendar of the Scottish landed gentry. No photographs of them from this period have been made public, no letters from Fenella describing their care, no entries in family diaries that acknowledge their existence in terms that a later generation might find and read. What we know is that by June 1941, the decision had been made. Nerissa was 22 years old, and Catherine was 15. Catherine, at 15, was still technically a child, admitted to an institution that housed adults, placed in wards alongside women decades older than herself, entering a system designed for permanent custody rather than temporary care. The timing admits more than one interpretation. Britain was in the middle of the Second World War. The country's social infrastructure was under extraordinary strain, and Fenella was a widow in her 50s, caring for two severely disabled adult daughters in a household reorganizing itself around wartime conditions. The most sympathetic explanation is the simplest. Fenella, overwhelmed and aging, could no longer provide the level of care her daughters needed, and institutionalization was the standard medical recommendation of the era, a course of action endorsed by the physicians, bureaucrats, and social workers whose professional advice shaped the decisions of families in her position. There is no evidence she acted with malice. By most accounts, she visited Nerissa and Catherine regularly at Earlswood until her own death in 1966, which suggests a woman who had not abandoned her daughters so much as surrendered them to a system she was told was better equipped to manage their needs. But the decision cannot be separated from its wider social and political context. By 1941, Fenella's sister-in-law had been queen consort for 5 years. The institution of hereditary monarchy, the foundational principle that one specific family possessed a natural right to the throne, was under scrutiny from a public that had watched one king walk away from the crown 3 years earlier and was now being asked to die for the institution his brother had inherited. The abdication had demonstrated, with a clarity that the establishment found deeply uncomfortable, that the hereditary principle was only as strong as the individuals who embodied it, and that those individuals could be flawed, unstable, or simply unwilling. In this climate, the existence of two non-verbal, severely disabled relatives classified by law as imbeciles was, at minimum, deeply inconvenient. The eugenics movement, mainstream since the 1880s, when Sir Francis Galton coined the term and began arguing for the managed reproduction of society's fittest members, had by the 1930s become a respectable doctrine backed by scientists, doctors, politicians, and the public, and encoded in law through the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913. Under that act, people deemed feeble-minded, idiotic, imbecile, or morally defective could be detained indefinitely without trial and without treatment, requiring only a doctor's certification and a family authorization, which made the institutionalization of disabled people a bureaucratic procedure rather than a moral reckoning, a form to be signed rather than a decision to be weighed. Marriage in aristocratic circles was partly a genetic transaction, the choice of a spouse made with reference to bloodlines, health records, and family histories stretching back generations, and a family with members classified as defective, to use the terminology its own class employed, faced the prospect of seeing its children's prospects destroyed by rumours of tainted blood. For the Bowes-Lyon family specifically, these concerns were amplified to an extraordinary degree by their sudden and total proximity to the throne. No surviving document records who made the final decision to place Nerissa and Catherine at Royal Earlswood, or whether it was made in consultation with anyone from the wider royal household. What is certain is that on the day Nerissa and Catherine were admitted, 3 of their maternal first cousins were admitted on the very same day. Idonia Fane was 29 years old, Rosemary was 27, and Etheldrida was 19, all 3 daughters of Fenella's sister Harriet, all 3 carrying similar disabilities, all 3 having been cared for at home until the same month in the same year, brought all 5 women to the same institutional door. The synchrony of 5 women from 2 interrelated families being committed to the same institution on the same date is not the signature of a spontaneous response to crisis. It is the signature of a planned solution to a problem that had been building for years, coordinated across 2 families, executed with the quiet administrative efficiency that the British upper class has always applied to arrangements it prefers not to discuss. 5 beds, 5 case files opened on the same date, 5 lives entering the same institutional machinery at the same moment. The logistics alone required planning, correspondence, and the kind of shared decision-making that does not happen over a single anxious telephone call. Somebody arranged the transport, somebody signed the papers, somebody ensured the wards would accommodate 5 new residents simultaneously, and somebody understood that none of this was to be spoken about in the drawing rooms where the family name was still currency. The women were placed in the wards of the Asylum Arch Road area of the hospital grounds, where they would share corridors and common rooms and daily routines for the remainder of their institutional lives. The gates closed behind them in June 1941, and for the 5 women who walked through, those gates would not open again. The daily life of Nerissa and Catherine inside the walls of Royal Earlswood can only be partially reconstructed from nursing testimony and fragmentary medical records, which is itself a statement about how thoroughly 2 lives can be made to disappear, while the bodies that contain them continue to occupy space. When the sisters arrived in 1941, the institution housed approximately 230 mentally disabled men and women, though it had at various points held up to 500, and the gap between those 2 numbers tells you most of what you need to know about staffing ratios and individual attention. The hospital was overcrowded and understaffed, conditions that were standard for institutions of its type during the war years, and that improved only marginally after the National Health Service absorbed the hospital in 1958. Former nurses interviewed for a 2011 Channel 4 documentary described a place where residents were referred to internally as inmates rather than patients, a linguistic choice that accurately reflected the institution's operational philosophy. One Surrey woman who visited her sister at Royal Earlswood during the 1950s recalled getting that gripping feeling around my heart of dread every time she approached the gates, which is not a phrase commonly associated with facilities that have their patients' interests at heart. The care was largely functional, the maintenance of bodies rather than the enrichment of lives. Nurses cut the sisters' hair, trimmed their nails, fed them when needed, managed their daily routines with the mechanical efficiency required when a small staff serves a large population of people who cannot serve themselves. There were no therapists, no structured developmental programs, no occupational engagement of the kind that Dr. Langdon Down had introduced a century earlier, and that had disappeared with him when he left to found his private institution. The sisters existed within the walls of a building that had once aspired to educate its residents and had long since settled for containing them. Nerissa and Catherine were non-verbal, unable to communicate abstract needs, entirely dependent for everything on the people around them, which meant that the quality of their existence was determined, day by day and hour by hour, by the attention and the kindness of whichever staff member happened to be on shift. Their world was the ward, the common room, the grounds when the weather permitted, the television when it eventually arrived, and the routine that gave each day its structure without giving any day its meaning. After Fenella's death in 1966, the nurses could not recall any visitors whose names they recognized, no letters that arrived bearing a family return address, no indication from the world outside the gates that anyone was thinking about them, asking after them, or counting the years since they had last been seen. Within those limitations, however, the nurses who spent years with the sisters described moments of genuine affection and visible joy, small human responses that the institution's architecture was not designed to encourage but could not entirely suppress. One of the most detailed accounts came from Nurse Onell Braithwaite, who recalled a scene from July 29, 1981. It was the day of the wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer, and the television in the common room was broadcasting the ceremony from St. Paul's Cathedral to an estimated global audience of 750 million people. Nerissa and Catherine were watching. As Queen Elizabeth appeared on the screen, both sisters began waving excitedly and saluting at the television with a recognition that the nurses found simultaneously touching and devastating. "I remember pondering with my colleague," Braithwaite later said, "how if things had been different, they would surely have been guests at the wedding." The sisters were responding with visible excitement to television footage of the family that had listed them as dead, waving at a woman who was their first cousin, and who, according to every publicly available genealogical reference, believed them to have died decades earlier. They were responding not with grief or bitterness, because grief and bitterness require a cognitive framework for injustice that neither woman possessed, but with something that looked, to every nurse who witnessed it, like uncomplicated joy. It is a scene almost too precisely calibrated to hurt. Two women, their identities stripped from every public record, their existence denied in the foundational texts of British aristocratic lineage, sitting in a common room in a Surrey institution less than an hour from Buckingham Palace, watching the glittering spectacle of the family whose bloodline they shared and whose public narrative they had been removed from, clapping at a screen that could not see them back. Nurse Sheila Rewell confirmed the sisters' responses to royal television appearances and would later testify to something considerably less comfortable: the absence of any family presence across the decades she worked at the hospital. Nurse Bridie Tingley put it with a directness that the diplomatic machinery of the Beauce-Lyon family never managed. "I never saw a visit. I am not condemning, but I still think the royalty didn't play their part. There was no connection with the royalty. That's no credit to them. They could have given her a very lavish funeral, but they didn't, and she had a pauper's grave." The hospital's League of Friends, a charitable support organisation, sent a letter to the Queen Mother in 1982, informing her that her nieces were still alive and in residence at Royal Earlswood. According to reports, the Queen Mother had genuinely believed them to be deceased, having relied, as everyone else had, on the information published in Burke's Peerage and never independently verified. When she learned the truth, she began sending money for toys and sweets on their birthdays and at Christmas, a gesture that was, by the standards of the family's resources, modest, and by the standards of the family's previous engagement with its institutionalized members, a considerable escalation. She never visited them. The Queen Mother, who was by 1982 one of the most beloved public figures in Britain, a woman whose public life was defined by warmth, duty, and a carefully cultivated image of grandmotherly compassion, did not make the journey from London to Red Hill to see the two women who were her brother's children, who had been living in a state institution for 41 years, and who had been officially declared dead in her hearing for the previous 19. Whatever her reasons, she kept them private, and the family did not volunteer them on her behalf. The mechanism by which Nerissa and Catherine were officially declared dead is, in certain respects, more disturbing than the institutionalization itself, because the institutionalization can at least be explained by the era's norms and the practical challenges of care, whereas the falsification of their deaths in a published genealogical record requires a different and considerably more deliberate kind of explanation. Burke's Peerage is not a government register. It is a privately published reference work, the so-called Bible of British aristocracy, tracking the genealogies of the peerage, baronetage, and landed gentry of the United Kingdom. And it prides itself with the particular intensity of a publication whose commercial value depends on its reliability, on accuracy. The process is straightforward. Berks sends forms to family members, asking them to update records of births, marriages and deaths, and it requires for deaths specific dates. In 1963, Fenella Bowes-Lyon received Berks' updated forms and returned them with the information that Nerissa had died in 1940 and Catherine had died in 1961. Both women were still alive. Nerissa was 44 years old and Catherine was 37, and both were living, as they had been for 22 years, at Royal Earlswood Hospital in Surrey. In the institution, the family was paying £125 per year to maintain. The official family explanation, offered in 1987 by Lord Clinton, Gerard Fane Trefusis, 22nd Baron Clinton, a descendant of Fenella's father, was that Fenella had been an elderly lady who was vague about filling in official forms, and that I imagine it was filled in wrongly or wasn't filled in at all. Lady Elizabeth Anson, Fenella's granddaughter, echoed this characterisation in a statement to the BBC. Her grandmother was a very vague person who often didn't fill out the forms that Berks' peerage sent her, either properly or completely. Berks' peerage pushed back firmly. A spokesperson said, "If this is what the Bowes-Lyon family told us, then we would have included it in the book." Berks requires specific dates, and the specific dates provided were specific. 1940 for Nerissa, 1961 for Catherine. You cannot accidentally invent a death date for one daughter and then, in the same administrative exercise, accidentally invent a completely different death date for a second daughter, each one carrying its own specific year. The first supposed death, Nerissa in 1940, predated the 1963 update by 23 years and placed the death before the institutionalisation itself, as though Nerissa had never been admitted to Earlswood at all, a detail that does not suggest vagueness so much as careful construction. The second supposed death, Catherine in 1961, was only 2 years before the form was submitted, suggesting a deliberate attempt to update and close the record while the deception was still plausible. The precision of the deception is what makes the vagueness defence so difficult to sustain. One daughter dead in 1940, the other dead in 1961, each date internally consistent with a narrative in which the family's inconvenient members had been quietly removed from the genealogical ledger at intervals that avoided the suspicion a simultaneous erasure might have provoked. The false death dates were carried in every edition of Berks' peerage from 1963 onward, and equally damningly, in Debrett's peerage as well. Nobody queried them. Nobody cross-referenced them against hospital records or parish registers, and nobody from the family contacted either publication to set the matter straight. These are not obscure publications. They are the foundational genealogical records of the British aristocratic class, consulted by biographers, historians and the marriage-minded, and the errors went unchallenged for 24 years because no one in a position to know the truth ever corrected them. The 24-year duration is worth pausing on. From 1963 to 1987, through the entirety of the 1960s, the 1970s, and most of the 1980s, through prime ministers, elections, royal weddings, jubilees, and the daily functioning of a family that was, throughout this period, the most documented household in the world. 2 entries in 2 genealogical reference books continued to state, incorrectly and with complete confidence, that Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon were dead. Fenella died in 1966, 3 years after filing the false information, without having amended the record. Her surviving daughters, Anne and Diana, had the information and the means to contact Berks' peerage at any time but apparently never did. Anne Bowes-Lyon, who had married into Danish royalty and moved in European aristocratic circles until her death in 1980, knew that her sisters were alive and in an institution throughout the 17 years she survived her mother. She did not correct the record. Diana Bowes-Lyon, who died in 1986, the same year as Nerissa, also knew the truth and also did not act. The wider Bowes-Lyon family, through successive Earls of Strathmore who functioned as its nominal heads, never intervened. The geography of the silence is what makes it so extraordinary. Royal Earlswood Hospital was barely an hour's drive from Buckingham Palace, closer to central London than many of the country houses where the family spent its weekends. And the family that had effectively written Nerissa and Catherine out of existence was not in a distant country, but in the same social world, attending the same events, and patronising, in the case of the Queen Mother, MenCap, the leading British charity for people with learning disabilities, an organisation whose entire stated purpose was the dignified inclusion of people with precisely the conditions that affected Nerissa and Catherine. The Queen Mother championed the cause of people with learning disabilities in public, while the Record declared her own nieces dead in private. The hospital was less than an hour away. The family paid the annual fees. For 24 years, that arrangement held, sustained not by a single act of concealment, but by the collective and continuous decision of an entire extended family to leave uncorrected, a public record that declared 2 living women dead. Nerissa Bowes-Lyon died on January 22, 1986, at the age of 66, inside the institution where she had lived for 45 years. Her funeral was attended only by hospital staff. No member of the Bowes-Lyon family was present, and no member of the royal family sent flowers. She was buried at Redstone Cemetery in Redhill, Surrey, less than a mile from the hospital, in a pauper's plot, the grave marked by a plastic tag bearing only a serial number. No gravestone, no inscription, no indication that the woman beneath the ground was the first cousin of the Queen of England. Her sister Catherine, still living in the hospital at the time, was reportedly present at the graveside, quiet, sensing that something was wrong, unable to articulate her grief in any language the mourners around her would have recognised as such. Nurse Sheila Rule confirmed she was one of the only people present at the burial. The nurses, who had cared for Nerissa across decades, were the mourners. The woman who had been the first cousin of the reigning Queen of England, whose family occupied the most photographed residence in the world, was lowered into an unmarked grave in a Surrey cemetery with the same institutional anonymity that had defined every other year of her adult life. In the spring of 1987, a reporter from The Sun received a tip. The specifics of how the lead emerged are not entirely clear from available records, but by April 1987, the reporter had enough information to act, and the action he took was to pose as a family member, gain access to Royal Earlswood Hospital, walk into the common room, and photograph a frail 61-year-old woman sitting in a chair, staring ahead at nothing in particular. That woman was Catherine Bowes-Lyon, and she had been listed as dead in every genealogical record of the British aristocracy for 26 years. The reporter had walked into the building, found a living woman whose official death had been published in the 2 most authoritative genealogical references in the English-speaking world, and photographed her sitting in an institutional common room in a state of apparent vacancy, alive and unvisited and entirely unknown to the public that bought the newspaper the following morning. The story that followed sent a wave of shock through the British public with an intensity that suggested the country had not entirely lost the capacity to be scandalised by the behaviour of its ruling class. The approximate headline, "Queen's Cousin Locked in Madhouse," deployed the tabloid vocabulary of outrage with the blunt effectiveness that The Sun had perfected over 2 decades of royal coverage. And the public reaction was one of confusion, anger, and a dawning sense that something profoundly wrong had been concealed for decades behind the polished surface of the monarchy's most carefully managed family. The Los Angeles Times ran the story on April 6, 1987, with the headline, "Burke's Peerage Given Faulty Facts, Queen's Dead Cousin Alive in Mental Hospital," and the Canadian magazine Maclean's published a detailed account the same month. The story crossed borders and languages with a speed that reflected its universally comprehensible moral content. A family of immense privilege had declared 2 of its own members dead while they were still alive, and one of them had been buried in a grave marked only by a number. The public outrage was not confined to Republicans or anti-monarchists. It cut across the usual divisions of British opinion about the royal family because the facts of the case were so stark that they did not require a political framework to be found appalling. The image of Nerissa's plastic-tagged grave, discovered by journalists in the days following the story, became the single most devastating emblem of the entire scandal. It reduced the abstract questions about institutional policy and bureaucratic deception to one concrete image, a photograph of a patch of ground that contained a woman who shared blood with the monarch and that bore no human name, only a serial number stamped on a tag that the rain and the soil would eventually dissolve. The Bowes-Lyon family scrambled to respond. Lady Elizabeth Anson issued a statement to the BBC insisting there had been no attempt at a cover-up and that many family members had visited the sisters, a claim that the hospital's own records and the nurse's subsequent testimony would directly and repeatedly contradict. Buckingham Palace's response was characteristically terse and surgically precise. "The Queen is aware of the report. We have no comment about it at all. It is a matter for the Bowes-Lyon family." That single sentence, with its institutional separation of the Queen from any moral responsibility, was legally impeccable. Nerissa and Catherine were not members of the royal family in any official capacity, and responsibility for their care lay with the extended family rather than the Crown. The statement did, however, confirm something that no amount of legal precision could obscure. The palace had known, and the palace had chosen to categorise the matter as someone else's problem. The moral weight of the statement did not survive contact with a public that understood the difference between legal responsibility and human obligation. The Queen Mother was alive, 86 years old, a beloved public figure, patroness of Mencap and her own nieces, had spent 46 years in a state-run institution without a headstone, without a family funeral, and without their lives being acknowledged in any public record. The institutional hypocrisy was, for a public accustomed to giving the monarchy the benefit of considerable doubt, difficult to digest. After the outcry, the three grandchildren of John and Fenella Bowes-Lyon, Lady Elizabeth Shackley, the 5th Earl of Lichfield, and Catherine Somerville, arranged for a headstone to be erected on Nerissa's grave. The inscription acknowledged what the preceding decades had worked to deny: that this woman had a name, a birth date, a family, an identity. The gesture, arriving after the shame of publicity rather than the impulse of love, struck observers as the kind of response that confirmed the accusation rather than answered it. When Royal Earlswood Hospital officially closed in March 1997, it was the end of a 142-year institutional story that had begun with a reformer's optimism and ended with a government's belated acknowledgement that the entire model had been a mistake. The building that Prince Albert had opened, where Dr. John Langdon Down had built his reforming career, where thousands of men and women had spent decades in institutional custody without meaningful appeal, was shuttered as part of the British government's long-delayed push toward community-based care, a push that had been gathering momentum since Enoch Powell's 1961 Water Tower speech as Minister of Health had initiated the drive to close the Victorian asylums, but that had been, in practice, extraordinarily slow, inconsistently funded, and frequently allowed to leave former patients without adequate community support. Catherine Bowes-Lyon was among the last residents to leave. She was 71 years old and had spent 56 years inside its walls, which meant that she had entered the building as a teenager during the Blitz and was leaving it as an elderly woman in the age of the internet, having experienced almost nothing of the world that had changed so profoundly between those two dates. She and her cousin Idonia Fane, the only two of the original 5 women admitted in 1941 who were still living, were moved together to a smaller care home called Ketwin House in Surrey, a facility that bore no resemblance to the Victorian grandeur and Victorian brutality of the institution they had left behind. The move was part of a national programme of resettlement that transferred former long-stay patients into smaller community homes across the country, an approach that represented a philosophical revolution in disability care, even if the execution was often rushed and the funding often inadequate. When Ketwin House itself closed in 2001, both women were moved again to another care home in the same county, the third residential arrangement of Catherine's adult life, each one smaller and quieter than the last, each one representing a marginal improvement in the quality of care and a marginal reduction in the scale of institutional anonymity. Her later years were described by the care workers who attended her with a mixture of sadness and warmth that characterized almost every professional account of the sisters across their institutional lives. She had no language, no way to communicate abstract needs, no access to the outside world except through television, the medium through which she had watched her cousin's family conduct its public life for decades. She responded to stimulation, to routine, to the presence of familiar faces. She enjoyed watching the royal family on television, a detail that every person who reported it found simultaneously endearing and unbearable. A care worker who appeared in the 2011 Channel 4 documentary said that Catherine could really have prospered, but instead she's been left to vegetate, an assessment that carries more weight from someone who changed the sheets than from someone who wrote the policy. In November 2011, Channel 4 broadcast The Queen's Hidden Cousins, a documentary directed by Kelly Close and produced by Minnow Films, featuring interviews with former nurses who had cared for Nerissa and Catherine across the decades. The documentary's central allegations were stark. Throughout their time at Royal Earlswood, no known record existed of either sister ever being visited by any member of the Bowes-Lyon or royal families after the early 1960s, and nurses were not aware of the sisters receiving birthday cards, Christmas gifts, or any other family acknowledgement during those years. The cumulative portrait was of two women who had been placed in an institution listed as dead and then left there for decades by a family that possessed the wealth, the connections, and the social standing to have ensured a very different outcome had they chosen to use any of them. The family's response was heated. Lady Elizabeth Shackerley, Fenella's granddaughter and a party planner to the Queen, called the programme cruel and intrusive. An anonymous royal source told the press that the Queen is very, very upset, and that the documentary contained utter lies, claiming both sisters had been visited regularly and that the sisters became hugely distressed when unfamiliar people arrived, which was why nurses had asked the family to stop coming. The hospital administrator's records, however, contradicted this account. Family visits had stopped after the early 1960s, and what appears most likely is that Fenella visited regularly until her death in 1966, and that after her death, contact largely ceased until the 1982 letter from the League of Friends reopened the question. Professor Jan Walmsley, a historian of learning disabilities at the Open University, offered the most measured public assessment. There was an opportunity at the time for the royal family, and particularly the Queen Mother, and they did nothing. Why that might have been, one wonders if there is still the hereditary taint around that was there in the early 20th century. Catherine Juliette Bowes-Lyon died on February 23, 2014, at the age of 87. She had spent 73 years in institutional or residential care, nearly her entire adult life. This time, the family held a private funeral, and no details were disclosed publicly. The news of her death passed with barely a mention in the press, reported only by local and niche genealogical sources, which was, depending on your reading, either an improvement on the indignity of her sister's burial or a final confirmation that the family's preferred method of managing Catherine's existence had always been silence. By the time she died, her first cousin, Queen Elizabeth II, was 87 years old. They shared the same birth year, 1926, Catherine arriving 3 months after Elizabeth, and they had grown up in the same extended family, on the grounds of the same Scottish castle, before their lives diverged so completely that the distance between a woman who became the most recognised figure on earth and a woman who died in a Surrey care home without anyone outside the family knowing her name cannot be measured in any unit the English language provides. The building where Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon spent the majority of their lives has been converted into luxury apartments, and the conversion has been executed with the tasteful architectural sensitivity that the British property development industry applies to buildings whose histories require careful repackaging. The grounds where 5 women from 2 interrelated families walked, sat, ate, slept, watched television, and grew old without being acknowledged by the people who placed them there are now marketed as Royal Earlswood Park. The main Victorian building, renamed Victoria Court, retains its red brick facade and Tudor Gothic profile. The architectural shell that William Bonathan Moffat designed and Prince Albert opened preserved as a heritage feature, while the interior has been comprehensively reimagined for a demographic that values period character and allocated parking in roughly equal measure. An indoor swimming pool has been installed. A tranquil library occupies a space that was, within living memory, a ward. In 2020, Netflix brought the story to a global audience through The Crown, Season 4, Episode 7, titled The Hereditary Principle, in which the fictional Princess Margaret discovers during a therapy session that she has 2 living cousins hidden in a Surrey institution, and confronts her mother, the fictional Queen Mother, who delivers a monologue justifying the concealment. The gene pool of that family better have 100% purity. If you add the Bowes-Lyon illnesses to that, the danger is it becomes untenable. The episode is powerful television. It correctly identifies the broad outlines of the scandal: the sisters' institutionalization, the false entries in Burke's peerage, the family's collective failure to acknowledge them across 5 decades. But its central dramatic thesis, that the Queen Mother was the conscious architect of a deliberate cover-up designed to protect the hereditary principle, overstates and distorts what is actually known about the family's motivations. Princess Margaret did not dramatically discover her cousins. The Queen Mother appears to have genuinely believed her nieces were dead until 1982, when the League of Friends wrote to inform her otherwise. The genetic disorder that affected the sisters did not come from the Bowes-Lyon bloodline at all, which makes the entire hereditary justification presented in the episode the precise inverse of the established genetic evidence. The episode's moral force, however, points towards something that no amount of factual correction can entirely diminish. The Bowes-Lyon family did conceal the sisters' existence from official records. They did allow a woman to be buried in a pauper's grave with no family present. They did fail, across decades and across generations, to use their considerable wealth and influence to improve the lives of 2 people who were, by blood, as close to them as any relatives they possessed. The parallel with the Kennedy family is not incidental. In 1941, the very same year Nerissa and Catherine were admitted to Earlswood, Joe Kennedy Sr. secretly arranged a prefrontal lobotomy for his intellectually disabled daughter, Rosemary, without informing her mother, reducing a 23-year-old woman to the developmental state of a 2-year-old and institutionalizing her in Wisconsin for the rest of her life. The Kennedys, like the Bowes-Lyons, explained the absence by claiming their daughter was reclusive. The pattern is consistent and instructive. 2 of the most visible families of the 20th century, one on each side of the Atlantic, each containing a daughter with intellectual disabilities, each choosing institutionalization, each maintaining silence for decades, and each eventually exposed by journalists rather than corrected by conscience. Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, had been moved to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate in 1916 as his epilepsy and developmental difficulties worsened, kept away from public life and cared for by his governess Charlotte Bill, until his death at 13 after a severe seizure, establishing within the royal family itself the precedent that members who did not conform to the institutional image could be relocated to where the institution did not have to look at them. The pattern across powerful families on both sides of the Atlantic was consistent. Disabled members treated as problems to be managed, committed to institutions with a combination of shame and convenience and the social logic of their class, and maintained in decades of silence using the machinery of secrecy that wealth and status make available. The story of Nerissa and Catherine is finally not only a royal story. It is a story about a system, the Victorian asylum system and its 20th century successors, that processed thousands of lives, most of them belonging to people with no royal connections, no tabloid reporters to discover their graves, and no Netflix dramatizations to bring their stories to a global audience. The vast majority of the men and women who lived and died inside Royal Earlswood over its 142 years of operation did so without ever being named in a newspaper, without ever receiving a visit from a journalist, and without anyone outside the institution's walls ever knowing or caring that they had existed. In 2024, more than 2,000 autistic people and people with learning disabilities in England were still being held in psychiatric hospitals, many detained under the Mental Health Act and placed far from their families. The logic of Royal Earlswood, the conviction that disability is best managed through institutional separation, has not been fully overcome. At Redstone Cemetery in Red Hill, barely a stone's throw from the Victorian gates of the former hospital, Nerissa Bowes-Lyon, lies beneath a headstone that was erected only after journalists made the absence of one a national embarrassment. Catherine was buried elsewhere in 2014, with a private family funeral arranged without public disclosure, which was a considerable improvement on a plastic tag and a serial number. Though the question of what precisely separates privacy from concealment is one the Bowes-Lyon family has never answered with complete clarity. The building where they lived is beautiful now. Its grounds are immaculate. Somewhere in those converted rooms, in the spaces that have been refloored and repainted and replumbed into elegant residences with period features and off-street parking, two women once sat watching their cousin wave from a palace balcony on a screen that could not see them back. They were never invisible, really. They were there all along. The world had simply been informed, in writing, that they were dead. His name was Prince John Charles Francis, and he was born on July 12, 1905, the fifth son and sixth child of King George V and Queen Mary, registered fifth in line to the throne of the British Empire, christened with godparents drawn from the crowned heads of Europe. He had his first epileptic seizure at the age of 4. By the time he was 8, he had vanished from every official royal portrait. By the time he was 11, he had been moved to a 5-bedroom farmhouse on the edge of the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, 2 miles from the main house, cared for by a nanny and a skeleton staff, visited by his family only when their schedules permitted, and kept so thoroughly from public view that most of Britain did not know he existed. He died in his sleep on January 18, 1919, at the age of 13, from a massive seizure, and his epilepsy was disclosed to the British public for the first time 2 days later in a single paragraph in the Daily Mirror that mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the prince had suffered from fits. His name was left out of his father's Silver Jubilee souvenir programmes in 1935. His letters to his parents, his personal photographs and his story remained sealed in the Royal Archives until 1998, when archivists cataloguing papers at Windsor discovered what the family had spent 8 decades keeping quiet. The farmhouse where he lived and died still stands on the Sandringham estate, its brown brick walls and beige roof unchanged in their essentials, its rooms having since sheltered Prince Philip in retirement and Prince Andrew in exile. Each generation finding in its quiet distance from ceremony a use the building has provided since 1916, the capacity to make a member of the royal family disappear. Today we walk through the rooms, the medical records, and the silence that kept a prince hidden for 13 years and his memory buried for 80 more. To understand why Prince John ended up where he did, it is necessary to understand where he came from. And where he came from was not, as one might expect, a palace. George V and Queen Mary raised their 6 children not in Sandringham House itself, the grand Jacobean revival mansion that dominated the Norfolk estate, but in the neighbouring York Cottage, a cramped Victorian warren that observers consistently described as a villa in Bournemouth or a glorified holiday cottage, its rooms so compressed that the royal nurseries were pushed into attic spaces barely fit for servants. Sandringham House, visible half a mile away through the trees, was occupied by George's widowed mother, Queen Alexandra, who lingered there long after her husband, King Edward VII's death in 1910, with the serene immovability of a woman who had no intention of being relocated by her own son. George V had inherited a preference for naval austerity from 2 decades at sea, and saw nothing wrong with raising a royal family in a house that most visitors found comically undersized for its purpose, which tells you a great deal about the man and almost nothing about what children require. He was disciplined, formal, prone to sudden rages, and constitutionally incapable of the easy tenderness that parenthood demands. One courtier wrote that he was more at ease with his animals than with his children, an observation that was meant as gentle criticism and that reads a century later as a clinical diagnosis. George had spent his formative years at sea, in a service that valued obedience, physical toughness, and the suppression of emotion, and he applied these values to his household with the conviction of a man who genuinely believed that what had been good enough for a naval cadet was good enough for a prince. His rages, which his children learned to fear, were not performative but sincere. He was angered by untidiness, by lateness, by any failure to meet the standards of deportment that he considered the minimum price of the privilege his children had been born into. His wife, Queen Mary, born Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, was equally constrained. A woman of formidable intellectual discipline and iron composure, who collected art with fierce passion and organised the household with military precision, but who rarely, if ever, permitted her feelings to surface in any setting where feelings might be observed. Outward demonstrations of maternal warmth were not among her gifts, and the nursery world at York Cottage operated according to the standard Edwardian aristocratic arrangement, in which children were raised primarily by nannies and governesses and presented to their parents at designated hours, which meant that the emotional distance between George and Mary and their children was structural as well as temperamental. It was in this dense, formal, slightly airless domestic atmosphere that Prince John Charles Francis came into being on July 12, 1905, the last of 6 children, the baby of a household that had not been designed to accommodate babies and that was about to be tested by one who would not conform to its rules. For the first 4 years of his life, John appeared entirely healthy. His christening attracted royal godparents from across Europe, King Carlos I of Portugal and King Haakon VII of Norway among them, and he was registered as 5th in the line of succession with a position in the dynasty that nobody at the time had any reason to question. He was, by all early accounts, a lively, spirited, endlessly curious child, whose energy bore no relationship to the constrained environment in which he was being raised. Where his older siblings had learned, at varying speeds and with varying degrees of damage, to modulate their behaviour to the expectations of the nursery and the drawing room, John had not learned this and would not learn it, a distinction that in his earliest years read as charm, and that would within a few years be reclassified as something far more troubling. His aunt Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone, remembered him as very quaint and recalled the toddler performing a running monologue of observations that left adults both startled and charmed, a child whose verbal energy and fearless directness made him, in the early years, the most entertaining member of a household not otherwise known for its spontaneity. His father once told President Theodore Roosevelt, when asked about his children, that all of them were obedient except John, a distinction that was meant at the time as affectionate exasperation, but that carries in retrospect the weight of everything that came after. The Dowager Empress of Russia, visiting Sandringham in 1909, wrote warmly to Tsar Nicholas II that George's children are very nice. The little ones, George and Johnny, are both charming and very amusing. These assessments, scattered across the letters and memoirs of the period, describe a child who was vivid in the family, rather than merely present, a personality whose energy stood out in a household where energy was typically suppressed in favour of deportment. The photographs from these early years confirm the impression. John appears in family groups with the same sailor suits and formal children's dress as his siblings, his expression sometimes less composed than theirs, sometimes more openly curious, but recognisably part of the same unit, the same dynasty, the same story. By his 4th birthday, however, the language used to describe him had begun to shift in ways that those around him noticed without fully understanding. Winsome became the word, and painfully slow, a quiet transition from charming to concerning that the household registered without yet having a name for what was happening. The boy who had prompted his father's affectionate exasperation and the Dowager Empress's warm reports was becoming, in the coded vocabulary of Edwardian upper-class domesticity, difficult, a word that covered a range of behaviours from the inconvenient to the unmanageable, and that, in 1909, was about to acquire a medical specificity that would change everything about his life and everything about how his family was prepared to acknowledge it. That was the year everything changed. Then, in 1909, the seizures began. The precise circumstances of John's first epileptic episode are not recorded in any surviving document, but by the time it occurred, sometime in his 4th year, the household of the then Prince and Princess of Wales was already aware that something was developmentally unusual about their youngest child. The seizure transformed that unease into something harder and more permanent. A medical fact, a social verdict, and an institutional problem, all delivered simultaneously, and none of them separable from the others. To understand why a single diagnosis could function as a kind of sentence, it is necessary to enter the intellectual world of Edwardian Britain, where the year 1909 sat at a particular convergence of scientific, legal, and cultural forces that had been building for half a century, and that had produced, by that point, a coherent and extraordinarily cruel consensus about what epilepsy meant and what should be done about the people who had it. The foundational intellectual figure in Victorian and Edwardian thinking about epilepsy was not a neurologist, but a criminologist, the Italian physician Cesare Lombroso, whose enormously influential Criminal Man and its successors had shaped medical and popular understanding of neurological difference across Europe and North America. Lombroso's central thesis was that criminality was a biological condition, that criminals were evolutionary degenerates, identifiable by physical and psychological stigmata, and that epilepsy was among the most telling of those stigmata. He had developed his theory of the epileptic criminal after observing the case of Miss Dear, an epileptic soldier who had killed several people during a seizure, and had subsequently argued that people with epilepsy constituted a distinct biological type, prone to violence, moral deficiency, and criminality, even in the intervals between seizures. By the time Prince John had his first fit, this framework had been absorbed into mainstream European medicine and popular culture, and its implications for anyone diagnosed with epilepsy were severe and comprehensive. Psychiatrist Benedict Morell's theory of inherited mental degeneration, the idea that families could follow a hereditary trajectory of progressive biological decline, with each generation manifesting worse symptoms than the last, had been a standard psychiatric text since 1860 and had been applied repeatedly to epilepsy. The epileptic character was a recognized clinical concept, defined by irritability, aggression, and moral weakness, even outside of seizures. The person with epilepsy was understood not as someone who had fits, but as someone who was fundamentally and hereditarily damaged, a person whose very bloodline was compromised. The word epileptic, in the medical and popular vocabulary of the era, did not describe a condition. It described an identity, and the identity it described was one that no family in public life could afford to claim. In 1911, eugenics was formally proposed at an international scientific congress as the solution to the problem of epilepsy, meaning the permanent surgical and social management of people with the condition to prevent their reproduction. And this was not a fringe position, but the mainstream scientific consensus at the moment when Prince John's condition was being managed within the royal household. The Eugenics Education Society, founded in Britain in 1907, counted among its members some of the most distinguished scientists and politicians of the era, and its arguments carried the authority of institutional science rather than the stigma of political extremism. For King George V, who at the time of John's first seizure was still Prince of Wales with his father Edward VII still alive but visibly declining, the diagnosis of epilepsy in his youngest child arrived at a moment of acute dynastic sensitivity. The Victorian and Edwardian monarchy had staked enormous symbolic capital on the idea of the royal family as the embodiment of the nation's biological and moral health. Queen Victoria, having famously been described as the grandmother of Europe, her descendants spread across the crowned heads of the continent, and the British monarchy's claim to legitimacy resting in part on a kind of hereditary virtue. The idea that the blood royal was in some sense better, stronger, more fit to govern than the blood of common subjects. Epilepsy in a prince was, within this framework, evidence of a crack in the dynastic edifice, because the eugenics movement's insistence that the condition was hereditary, that it was passed down through bloodlines and would manifest in successive generations with increasing severity, meant that John's diagnosis implicitly raised questions about the entire royal bloodline. The questions that the framework of hereditary degeneracy made unavoidable were acute and specific: whether the condition was lurking in the other children, recessive and unmanifested, whether it could be traced back through Queen Victoria's lineage, already notorious among geneticists for the transmission of haemophilia through her descendants into the royal families of Spain and Russia, whether the blood royal, which the monarchy had spent a century presenting as uniquely fit to govern, was in fact carrying a defect that would worsen with each successive generation. These questions were never asked publicly, but the family's advisors would have understood them with perfect clarity. There was also, more immediately, the question of image. George V's succession to the throne in 1910 would require the public projection of a family that embodied strength, health and dynastic continuity, and a prince with uncontrolled epilepsy, displaying the erratic behaviour and failed education that the medical literature of the era predicted, was a profound threat to that projection. The family that was about to become the most photographed, most reported on, and most symbolically scrutinised household in the British Empire could not afford to have its youngest member contradict, in public, the narrative of hereditary fitness on which the institution's legitimacy partly rested. The decision to conceal John's condition was not taken immediately, and it was not absolute in its initial phases, but it was taken incrementally over the years following the first seizure, and it was taken with an awareness of the dynastic stakes that would have been entirely familiar to any member of the Edwardian ruling class. For a child diagnosed with epilepsy in 1909, the available medical treatment was potassium bromide, a salt that had been the only recognised anticonvulsant in Western medicine since the surgeon Sir Charles Locock first demonstrated its effectiveness in 1857. Phenobarbital, the first truly modern anti-epileptic drug, would not be introduced until 1912, and at the time of John's diagnosis it was entirely unknown. Bromide was all there was, and it worked, after a fashion. Late 19th century studies showed that roughly a quarter of patients treated with potassium bromide had their seizures entirely controlled, while another large proportion showed partial improvement and a significant minority received no benefit at all. What bromide also did, and what those patients and their families knew, and what the doctors prescribing it acknowledged while considering the side effects preferable to a lifetime of unpredictable fits, was slow the mind. Potassium bromide's mechanism of action involves the suppression of neuronal activity through GABA receptor pathways, and at effective anticonvulsant doses, this suppression is not confined to the seizure-producing circuits of the brain, but spreads into the systems that govern learning, attention, and emotional regulation. Side effects documented in the medical literature of the period and confirmed by modern pharmacological research include continual sleepiness, diminished mental function, drooling, a staggering gait, severe acne-like skin lesions, and at higher doses a mental dullness and apathy that contemporary physicians described as bromism, a chronic toxicity that could produce states indistinguishable from dementia. If John was receiving bromide, and it is overwhelmingly probable that he was given the absence of any alternative, then some portion of what observers described as his slowness, his drifting attention, his difficulty in sustained academic engagement may have been pharmacological rather than purely neurological. He was being treated with the only tool available, and that tool was, in meaningful ways, making him worse at the things his parents' world most valued. This is one of the most quietly devastating aspects of his story. The treatment that was meant to manage his condition was simultaneously contributing to the symptoms that made his condition most visible and most stigmatized. Beyond the epilepsy, John showed signs from early childhood of what would today be identified as autism spectrum disorder, though the word autism did not exist in its modern sense until Leo Kanner's landmark 1943 paper, more than 2 decades after John's death. In 1909, the behavioral profile that John was presenting had no coherent name, no unified clinical framework, and no established treatment. What it had was a series of descriptors, backward, slow, difficult, peculiar, that were applied without precision and interpreted through the lens of the degeneracy theories then dominant in medical thinking. The specific behaviors that historians and clinical commentators have identified as consistent with autism are documented across multiple independent sources: persistent difficulty with eye contact and social reciprocity, an unfiltered directness that charmed those who loved him and embarrassed those who expected royal propriety, intense and specific attachments to animals and objects that had the quality of what autism researchers describe as restricted and repetitive interests, and a learning style built on sensory engagement and pattern recognition rather than formal instruction. His comment that his father was an ugly old man when watching him kiss the Queen was merely the most anecdotally preserved of a long series of observations that carried the devastating accuracy of a mind that had never learned the social function of dishonesty. His tutor, Henry Peter Hansel, a conscientious but limited man who had already demonstrated his inadequacy with John's older brothers Edward and Albert, both of whom had emerged from his instruction ill-prepared for their institutional education, found formal academic instruction essentially impossible. The Latin, military history, mathematics and composition that constituted the standard royal curriculum could not be delivered to a child whose attention could not be directed through conventional classroom methods. What John could do, and what Hansel eventually came to accept rather than fight, was learn through doing, through engagement with the physical world, through the particular obsessive intensity with which he approached the things that interested him. The schoolroom was abandoned gradually in favour of something more like supervised exploration, which was not a progressive educational philosophy, but a pragmatic recognition of failure. And it left John increasingly outside the developmental trajectory that his siblings were following, falling further behind year by year as his brothers collected educational credentials and military commissions, while his own world contracted to the things he could touch, tend, and engage with directly. The medical historian who contributed the BMJ's assessment of Prince John following the 2003 BBC drama noted that none of the pervasive developmental disorders, such as Asperger's syndrome, had been described at the time of his illness, and the British Epilepsy Association and numerous subsequent commentators have accepted the probability of an autism spectrum condition alongside John's documented epilepsy, the two conditions sharing a documented comorbidity, with seizure disorders occurring significantly more frequently in autistic individuals than in the general population. A connection that was entirely unknown in 1909, but that may have reflected a shared underlying neurological basis for both presentations. What this means, translated into the language of John's actual experience, is that he was navigating a world designed for a type of mind he did not have, medicated with a drug that further impaired the cognitive capacities he did have, assessed by doctors whose frameworks pathologized his entire mode of being, and managed by parents whose anxieties about hereditary fitness made his condition a dynastic emergency as well as a private grief. The cruelty was not personal, but structural. The entire apparatus of Edwardian medicine, Edwardian law, and Edwardian social expectation was arranged against a child whose only offence was to have been born with a brain that worked differently from the one his family's position required. He was 4 years old. George V acceded to the throne on May 6, 1910, following the death of Edward VII, and the family's public role intensified in ways that made John's continued presence in the official narrative increasingly difficult to sustain. Now, King and Queen, George and Mary were required to project an image of a dynasty defined by strength, duty, health, and hereditary virtue. And every public appearance, every official portrait, every newspaper account of the royal children's education and activities was an element in a carefully managed representation of dynastic fitness. The coronation of June 1911 was the first formal moment of exclusion. John, then 5 years old, was kept away from the ceremony entirely, the official explanation being that the child was unwell, which was technically accurate and deliberately vague. The real calculation was more specific. The prospect of a seizure during one of the most watched public events in the Empire, in the full presence of foreign dignitaries, the press and the assembled aristocracy of Britain, was simply unthinkable, because an epileptic fit at the Abbey would have been reported, and the questions that followed would have been unanswerable, without disclosing what the family had spent 2 years concealing. The absence of John from the coronation was the first institutional act of erasure, the first time the family's public image was officially composed without him. The practical consequences of the intellectual framework that surrounded epilepsy were, meanwhile, being encoded in British law. The Lunacy Act of 1890 and the various regulations governing poor law institutions made no meaningful legal distinction between epilepsy and insanity, and someone with severe epilepsy could be, and frequently was, committed to a pauper lunatic asylum. The Mental Deficiency Act of 1913, which received royal assent just 4 years after John's first seizure, created explicit statutory categories for idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded persons and moral imbeciles, and gave local authorities broad powers to institutionalize anyone falling within these categories, its reach explicitly covering people with epilepsy who could be committed if deemed unable to benefit from ordinary schooling or requiring care, supervision or control. For families of means, the preferred alternative to the asylum was the epileptic colony, a residential institution based on agricultural labour and fresh air, designed to provide a tolerable existence for people with epilepsy while removing them entirely from public life. The National Society for the Employment of Epileptics had established the Chalfont Colony in Buckinghamshire in 1894, the first institution of its kind in England, on a farm at Chalfont Common near Rickmansworth, and the Lingfield Farm Colony in Surrey followed in 1896, receiving 120 epileptic children in 1899 alone, many transferred directly from workhouses and lunatic asylums. The conditions in these colonies were not uniformly terrible, but they were defined by a fundamental assumption that people with epilepsy could not participate in ordinary society and should not be expected to try. Women residents at Chalfont spent the first part of each week washing hundreds of institutional laundry items, then from Wednesday to Saturday ironing them, with fruit picking and haymaking added in summer. Men at similar institutions were employed on farms, in gardens, in dairies and workshops, and these were not rehabilitative programs aimed at eventual reintegration, but permanent arrangements designed to make the institutionalized population useful rather than visible. A prince could not be sent to the Chalfont colony, and a royal child could not appear in a lunatic asylum's admissions register, but the logic of removal, the deep cultural conviction that people with epilepsy should be separated from ordinary life, was as available to the royal family as to anyone else. As John's siblings moved through the established pathways of royal childhood in the years that followed, the contrast sharpened. Edward went to Osborne Naval College, Albert followed him into naval training, Henry and George were dispatched to preparatory schools in the established manner of upper-class English boys. Mary began the programme of public engagements that would define her adult life, and each sibling was being fitted, more or less willingly, into the institutional machinery that produced royal adults. John remained in the nursery world of York Cottage with his tutor and his nanny, falling further behind year by year as his brothers collected educational credentials and military commissions, and his sister began to be photographed at charitable events. The photographic record of Prince John's progressive erasure from official royal imagery is one of the most concrete documentations of the concealment process. He appears clearly in family photographs through 1912 and into 1913, the standard formal portraits of the royal children posed with their parents, or in sibling groups that were distributed to newspapers and sold as souvenirs. In these images he is present, if sometimes slightly separate from the rest of the group, his expression often less formally composed than those of his siblings. And then, precisely coinciding with the intensification of his condition and the family's growing concern about public exposure, he begins to disappear. The last image believed to represent an official royal portrait of John dates from 1913, when he was 8 years old, and after that year he appears in no formal royal photographs. He was not excluded from family life entirely. Private photographs discovered in the Royal Archives in 1998 show him at Wood Farm and on the Sandringham estate in subsequent years. And these images, taken by family members rather than official photographers, have a warmth and informality entirely absent from the official record. But the public face of the royal family, as composed for newspapers, official publications and commemorative materials, ceased to include him. This erasure was managed rather than proclaimed. Nobody issued a directive ordering that John be excluded from official portraits, but official photograph sessions simply did not include him, official communications did not mention him, and the press, operating under the considerable deference toward the monarchy that characterized Edwardian and early Georgian journalism, did not ask why. The institutional silence that surrounded John was maintained not through censorship, but through the tacit cooperation of a media culture that understood, without being told, that certain questions were not to be asked. What makes this silence particularly extraordinary is that John was, formally, still a prince of the realm, still registered in the line of succession, still legally a member of the royal family with all the rights and status that implied, and his erasure from public consciousness was social and institutional rather than legal, a removal from the visible record that left his legal existence untouched. He was hidden precisely because his visibility had been withdrawn. Through the years of John's slow withdrawal from public life, it was Charlotte Lala Bill who maintained the most continuous and intimate knowledge of his actual condition. Lala had been part of the royal nursery household since before John's birth, serving as a nursery maid to the royal children since at least 1904, and her relationship with the youngest prince had deepened from professional responsibility into something closer to maternal devotion, as his condition separated him increasingly from normal family life. She managed his seizures with the practiced calm of a woman who had learned through repetition what medical science could not yet teach through instruction. She organized his days, served as his primary interpreter to the outside world, and communicated regularly with Queen Mary about his progress and setbacks, providing the kind of detailed, unsentimental reporting that the Queen required, and that the household physicians supplemented but could not replace. At some point in the years before the permanent move to Wood Farm, the exact timing undocumented, Lala Bill wrote to the palace with an observation that has since become one of the most cited passages in accounts of Prince John's life. The household dared not let him be with his brothers and sister because it upsets them so much with the attacks getting so bad and coming so often. That sentence established that John's continued presence in the main royal household had become genuinely disruptive, beyond embarrassing, practically unmanageable, that his siblings were distressed by witnessing his seizures, which had increased in both frequency and severity, and that the eventual decision to move John was precipitated by a deteriorating clinical situation, as much as by the dynastic concerns that had been building since 1909. John's condition by the mid-1910s was, by any measure, severe. His seizures were frequent and violent. He could not be educated through conventional means. He could not participate in the social events that structured royal life, and his doctors would have described his trajectory as unfortunately typical of severe refractory epilepsy in a young patient whose seizures had resisted the only available medication. The framing does not resolve the moral question of what was done, because removal is still removal, whatever its justifications, but it does complicate the narrative of simple parental shame. By 1916, when John was 11, the arrangement had become permanent. The war had made the decision easier in the sense that it provided a practical justification: the disruption of the household, the absence of the older children, the demands on the King and Queen's time that could be cited without reference to the deeper and more uncomfortable motivations that had been accumulating since the first seizure 7 years earlier. The First World War had profoundly disrupted the rhythms of royal life. George V was consumed by wartime duties, visiting troops and maintaining morale, and navigating the political tensions that would force the family to abandon their German surname in 1917 and adopt Windsor in its place. Queen Mary had thrown herself into wartime charity work. Edward was pressing to serve on the front. Albert was in the Royal Navy. The older children were being drawn into the war effort, and they were no longer boys and girls to be supervised in nurseries, and the household that had previously absorbed John's care, alongside the management of 5 other children, was now a household whose attention was directed entirely elsewhere. Wood Farm was chosen with a logic that combined practicality and concealment in equal measure. It was close enough to Sandringham House, approximately 2 miles by road, that family visits were entirely feasible, and far enough from the main house that its occupant could live without attracting attention. The village of Wolferton, pressed up against the western edge of the Sandringham estate, was a close-knit community of estate workers who could be relied upon for discretion, and the farm's position near the Royal Pheasant Grounds meant that the movement of staff and supplies would arouse no curiosity among local people accustomed to seeing estate activity in all directions. The railway station at Wolferton, which had served the royal family since Queen Victoria's era, meant that visitors and supplies could arrive without passing through any public thoroughfare, a detail of infrastructure that suited the purpose of concealment as effectively as any deliberate architectural planning. The farmhouse itself was modest by any standard: 5 bedrooms, a working kitchen garden, outbuildings that served as stables, and enough open ground for the outdoor activities that constituted John's primary pleasures, all of it set in the characteristic Norfolk landscape of flat agricultural land threaded with drainage channels and shelter belts of Scots pine, with a sense of enormous sky overhead, and on clear days a distant view toward the tidal flats of the Wash. The house's open-beamed rooms were built for practicality, low-ceilinged by palace standards, warm in winter with open fires, and designed for a life that had nothing to do with ceremony or display. Wood Farm announced nothing except the desire to be left alone, which was precisely the quality that made it suitable for its new purpose. It bore, in other words, an unmistakable resemblance to the epileptic colonies that Edwardian philanthropy had established at Chalfont in Buckinghamshire and Lingfield in Surrey, not in its institutional character, for John lived in comfort with devoted personal staff and his family nearby, but in its underlying logic of fresh air, agricultural landscape, removal from public life, and the therapeutic assumption that people with epilepsy should be managed through physical engagement with the natural world. The colony's founding ideology, as articulated by its patron Sir William Broadbent, had held that an outdoor life and intellectual and physical activities were a very great help in the restoration of nervous equilibrium, and Wood Farm's setting, whether by design or by the unconscious absorption of prevailing medical opinion, embodied that ideology in every particular. Whether this resemblance was conscious or accidental, it placed John's arrangement squarely within the dominant paradigm of how Edwardian England believed people with his condition should live. The prince was kept from the colony, but the colony's assumptions came to him. The farmhouse at Wood Farm that became Prince John's World from approximately 1916 to his death in January 1919 was a structure of vernacular Norfolk character. Interconnected long, narrow volumes of brown brick, low-ceilinged by palace standards, warm in winter with open fires, and entirely without pretension. The house is often described as comfortable rather than fine. a distinction that meant something very specific in Edwardian royal circles, where even secondary residences were expected to have a certain grandeur, and Wood Farm had no grandeur whatsoever. What it had instead was the quality of a place where life could be lived without the performance that attended royal existence everywhere else. The household was small but carefully composed. At its centre was Lala Bill, who organised John's days with brisk affection and served, in the absence of his parents, as the stable human constant of his existence. Henry Peter Hansel continued to provide what education was possible, and the household was completed by a coachman, a cook, and a live-in maid, a skeleton staff by royal standards, but more than sufficient for the life that was actually lived there. What distinguished John's life at Wood Farm from institutional confinement was its texture, its genuine engagement with the natural world and the small community around it. John kept chickens, tending them with an intensity that those who observed him described as profound rather than casual. He had a kitchen garden plot designated as his own, in which he worked with evident satisfaction. He had a bicycle and rode it with enthusiasm across the estate paths. He had a horse. He went for long walks through the pheasant grounds and along the margins of the estate's woodlands. And these were not therapeutic activities prescribed by doctors, but simply what John liked to do. And in the absence of courtly obligations, there was nothing to prevent him from doing them. Perhaps the most significant element of John's social world at Wood Farm was Winifred Thomas, a girl from Halifax who had been sent to stay with her aunt and uncle on the Sandringham estate, the uncle being George Stratton, a stable groom, to help with her chronic asthma in the sea-influenced Norfolk air. Winifred visited Wood Farm almost every day. She and John played together with a naturalness that John could not achieve in formal royal settings, where his behaviour was constantly monitored for signs of inappropriateness or embarrassment, and their friendship, sustained over the years of John's seclusion, was the closest thing to a peer relationship he ever had. The friendship was significant precisely because it was ordinary, two children playing together on an estate in Norfolk, one of them a prince whose existence the Empire did not know about, and the other a girl from Halifax whose asthma had brought her to the sea air, both of them finding in each other's company the uncomplicated pleasure of being liked without conditions. Winifred Thomas's later recollections of John, preserved in fragments, describe a cheerful, curious boy who laughed easily and who kept her company with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had never learned to be diplomatic. And she remembered him as happy, in his own world, at Wood Farm. Queen Alexandra, John's paternal grandmother, was another constant in his life. The old queen, now in the final years of her own life, had always adored John with a lack of inhibition that his parents found difficult to match. She gave him a garden plot at Sandringham House and visited him regularly. Alexandra had been profoundly deaf for much of her adult life and had developed unusually sensitive means of nonverbal communication, a capacity that served her well in her relationship with a grandson whose own communication was unconventional and whose needs were better met by presence than by conversation. She did not require him to perform normalcy. She did not measure his progress against the developmental milestones that the medical establishment applied to children of his age. She simply loved him, with the uncomplicated directness that her own deafness had taught her was the only form of communication that survived the loss of everything else. The question of how deeply and consistently George V and Queen Mary loved their youngest son is one of the most contested in royal history. George V was, by every account, a more emotionally available father to John than he was to his other children, because with Edward, Albert, Henry and George, he was distant, critical and occasionally cruel in his insistence on military bearing and formal deportment. But with John, the requirements that generated this harshness did not apply. John was never going to join the Navy or attend Eton or one day be king, and he was exempt, by the nature of his condition, from the machinery of royal expectation that made George V's relationship with his other sons a source of sustained mutual suffering. Within that exemption, something more genuinely tender seems to have been possible between father and son. George V visited Wood Farm. The record is not precise about how often, but his wife's diaries and household accounts confirm regular contact, and the visits appear to have had a quality of ease that his interactions with his more formally successful children conspicuously lacked. He did not pretend the boy did not exist. Queen Mary's response was characteristically more suppressed. She followed John's health closely, received regular reports from Lala Bill, and was with him in the days before his death, but her feelings about her youngest child were committed to private papers rather than public expression. In the manner of a woman for whom emotional display was a form of weakness, she had trained herself not to permit. The narrow world the family allowed him was, by any external measure, diminished in scope, but within that scope, by every account of those who actually witnessed it, the life John lived at Wood Farm was genuinely alive. The years of the First World War, from 1914 to 1918, were the years in which Prince John's world contracted to its narrowest point. His father was perpetually occupied with the demands of wartime sovereignty, visiting factories and munitions plants, touring military hospitals, receiving ministers and generals. His mother had thrown herself into relief work, presiding over committees and visiting institutions with exhausting regularity. His eldest brother Edward was at the front, serving in the Guards, frustrated at being kept away from the actual fighting but present in France. Albert was at sea, including at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. George was in the army. His sister Mary was nursing. The entire family had been folded into the mechanism of the war effort, and John remained at Wood Farm, following a routine that was in its own way as structured and purposeful as those of his siblings, even if it led nowhere in the conventional sense. His days were organised around the animals, the garden, the kitchen and the estate paths. Lala Bill ran the household with brisk affection, and Hansel maintained a semblance of academic routine, reading and arithmetic and basic geography, though the educational project had largely given way to the therapeutic one. Visitors came: Queen Alexandra, local estate families, Winifred Thomas almost daily. The rhythm was quietly domestic, insulated from the wider catastrophe of the war, but not unaware of it. For John would have heard and known that his brothers were at risk, that the empire was under threat, that the world outside Wood Farm had been transformed in ways that the adults around him discussed with a gravity he could register, even if he could not fully articulate his understanding of it. George V and Queen Mary visited when their schedules allowed, which was less frequently than either might have wished, but more than the narrative of wholesale abandonment suggests. Letters were exchanged. John's letters, written with the help of Lala Bill, have survived in archives and are documents of striking tenderness. Their affection toward dear Mama and dear Papa, unaffected by any bitterness at his circumstances, their observations about the chickens and the garden specific and joyful, their requests for visits expressed with a directness that his parents' own correspondence largely lacked. Several of these letters were rediscovered in 1998, along with personal photograph albums, when archivists were cataloguing papers at the Royal Archives, and their discovery was the catalyst that returned John to public attention after decades of near-total obscurity. Christmas, 1918, the first Christmas of the peace, was spent at Sandringham, and John attended the family Christmas. He was driven from Wood Farm to Sandringham House and spent the day with his family, and it was, by all accounts, a day of particular warmth. The war was over. The eldest sons were home, and the family was together in the same building for the first time in years. A gathering that the preceding 4 years of separation and anxiety had made feel, for once, like an occasion worth celebrating, rather than a duty to be performed. John was part of it. For one day, the arrangement that had kept him apart was suspended, and he was a member of the family in full, present at the table, present in the house, present in the company of siblings who had spent years at a distance that was geographical as well as emotional. And then he was driven back to Wood Farm that evening, as was the established arrangement. He was 13 years old, and he had 4 weeks to live. In the early evening of January 18th, 1919, a Saturday, Prince John suffered a massive epileptic seizure at Wood Farm and died in his sleep. He was 13 years and 6 months old. The time of death was recorded as approximately 5:30 in the afternoon. Lala Bill, who was with him as she had been with him every day for the preceding 13 years, called the Sandringham House household immediately, and George V and Queen Mary drove to Wood Farm that evening to see the body of their youngest child in the room where he had spent his last years. The precise nature of the fatal seizure was consistent with what medical science now calls sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, or SUDEP, a phenomenon in which a severe seizure suppresses respiratory function during sleep, causing the patient to stop breathing, and it was not an unusual manner of death for a person with severe uncontrolled epilepsy in an era before modern anticonvulsants. The funeral was held 3 days later, on January 21, 1919, at the Church of St Mary Magdalene on the Sandringham estate, the small, flint-built Anglican church that had served the royal household for generations and whose modest proportions were, for once, appropriate to the scale of the life being commemorated. The service was attended not only by the family and official mourners, but notably by virtually every person employed on the Sandringham estate: grooms, gamekeepers, gardeners, farm workers, household staff, standing gathered around the churchyard gates in a spontaneous assembly that said something important about how John had been known and regarded in the world immediately around him, not as an embarrassment or a burden, but as a person of genuine presence and worth whose death was felt by the community that had watched over him for years. His grave in the churchyard was covered in flowers. He was buried beside his uncle, Prince Alexander John, who had died in 1871 at the age of 1 day, 2 princes named John lying together in the Norfolk earth, one who had lived for a single day, and one who had lived for 13 years without the world being told he was there. Queen Alexandra, who attended, is recorded as saying quietly, "Now our 2 darling Johnnies lie side by side." The death of Prince John did not produce a uniform family response, and the surviving letters reveal a household divided by temperament and by the degree of engagement each member had actually maintained with the boy they had lost. Edward, Prince of Wales, at the time 24 years old and recently returned from the Western Front, wrote to his mistress Freda Dudley Ward on January 20th, 1919, 2 days after John's death, in language that has become one of the most quoted and most disturbing passages in modern royal correspondence. "John was more of an animal than anything else," Edward wrote, "and his death was the greatest relief imaginable, representing a release for both the boy and his parents from a life that was no life at all. He acknowledged his own callousness even as he exercised it, writing that he felt such a cold-hearted and unsympathetic swine for his reaction, and that he feared his mother would be deeply distressed." In a subsequent letter to Queen Mary, he apologised explicitly for the phrase. The letter has been quoted extensively as evidence of the royal family's dehumanisation of John, and it is, unambiguously, a deeply disturbing document. What it also reveals, however, is a young man of 24 who had spent 3 years watching men die in industrial quantities on the Western Front, who had developed a defensive emotional numbness in response, and who had had almost no meaningful relationship with his youngest brother in the years before his death. Edward had been away at school, at Naval College, and then at war during precisely the years when John was becoming the person he was. Their estrangement was not only temperamental, but circumstantial, and Edward's cruelty was the cruelty of a stranger. Queen Mary's diary entry for January 18, 1919, recorded that, at 5:30 our poor darling little John passed away suddenly after one of his attacks. The word "suddenly" is significant. It suggests she had not expected the crisis on that particular day, though she had long known it was coming. She wrote in another letter that John's death was the greatest mercy, language that has been quoted as parallel to Edward's callousness, but that reads differently in context, as the private expression of a mother who had watched her child suffer for 10 years, and who, like parents of children with severe uncontrolled epilepsy in every era, had come to understand that the seizures were not going to stop, and that the trajectory was not going to improve. The distinction between Edward's greatest relief written to a mistress, and Mary's greatest mercy, written in grief, is a distinction between emotional avoidance and maternal anguish, even if the words are superficially similar. George V's recorded response was characteristically spare. He wrote briefly to his mother and to senior household staff, he attended the funeral, and he kept his feelings, as he always kept his feelings, almost entirely private. The concealment, however, did not end with John's death. In many respects, it intensified. The illness that had defined his entire existence since the age of 4 was reported to the public for the first time on January 20th, 1919, in a brief death notice in the Daily Mirror that mentioned his fits as a parenthetical detail. And the newspapers largely accepted this framing without further investigation, a restraint that reflected both the deference of the press toward the monarchy and the calculated management of information by the palace's communication apparatus. This was the first time the British public learned that a son of the king had epilepsy, and the disclosure was made only because disclosure could no longer be avoided, the boy being dead and the death requiring some public explanation. The silence that had surrounded John for a decade had been maintained through an informal arrangement between the palace and the press that required no formal censorship, only the shared understanding that the monarchy's private difficulties were not material for public reporting, an arrangement that would hold, in various forms, for most of the century that followed. The Silver Jubilee of 1935, 16 years after John's death, produced souvenir programs and official commemorative materials that included family trees, portraits, and biographical summaries of the royal family, and John's name did not appear in them. A child of the king, a prince of the realm, a person who had lived for 13 years, was simply absent from the official record of his own father's reign. This omission was more deliberate than any single act of concealment during his lifetime, because by 1935, John was dead, and there was nothing left to conceal except the fact of his existence, and the choice was made to conceal even that, which transformed the concealment from a pragmatic response to a medical crisis into a permanent editorial decision about which members of the family deserved to be remembered. The British Epilepsy Association, commenting in later years on the royal family's handling of John, stated that there was nothing unusual in what they did. People with epilepsy were put apart, and it was another 20 years before the idea of non-segregation took hold. The observation is simultaneously true and insufficient as a moral judgment. It places the family within the norms of its era without asking whether a family of that wealth, that influence, and that capacity to shape public opinion had an obligation to exceed those norms rather than to conform to them. The concealment of John was not a single decision enacted at a single moment, but a process, gradual, cumulative, and normalised by the broader culture in which it occurred. The coronation absence in 1911, the fading from official photographs after 1913, the move to Wood Farm in 1916, the silence of the press during his lifetime, the minimal disclosure at his death, the omission from the Jubilee in 1935, each step building on the last until the erasure was so complete that a prince of the British Empire could be born, live for 13 years, and die without the public that his family ruled ever learning his name. Prince John existed in the public memory for most of the 20th century as a footnote, a brief mention in royal biographies, a name in genealogical tables, an asterisk appended to the family of George V. The event that returned him to wider attention was the discovery in 1998 of a cache of personal photograph albums and letters in the Royal Archives at Windsor, materials that had survived 8 decades of official silence, preserved in the archives but not catalogued or publicised, and whose rediscovery prompted initial newspaper coverage and, eventually, a significant creative response. That response was Stephen Polyakov's BBC drama The Lost Prince, broadcast in January 2003 to an audience of millions, starring Miranda Richardson as Queen Mary, Gina McKee as Lala Bill, Tom Hollander as King George V, and Bill Nighy as the royal physician, a production that dramatised John's life from birth to death, with a combination of historical accuracy and emotional intelligence that transformed public understanding of the story. The film won Emmy Awards and BAFTA nominations and is credited by historians and disability advocates with having done more than any academic work to restore John to public consciousness and to frame his story not as an embarrassing royal secret, but as a profoundly human narrative about difference, love, and institutional shame. The actor chosen to play John, a child performer named Daniel Williams, brought to the role a quality of luminous particularity that made the tragedy of his seclusion viscerally immediate for audiences who had never heard the story. The title Polyakov coined, The Lost Prince, entered the common language and has been the dominant frame for discussing John ever since. The posthumous identification of Prince John as having likely had autism spectrum disorder, in addition to his documented epilepsy, has, in the years since, reframed the entire story. If John had autism, then his behavioural difficulties, his inability to perform the social rituals of royal life, his intense attachments and unfiltered speech were not pathologies to be managed or concealed, but simply different ways of being in the world, different but not lesser. And the farmhouse at Wood Farm may have been the environment in which he was most fully himself, engaged with his chickens and his garden and his friend Winifred, freed from the crushing demands of a social performance he was constitutionally unable to give. King Charles III became patron of the Epilepsy Society in 2024, consciously connecting the modern monarchy to a history it had previously preferred to ignore, a gesture symbolically loaded given the family's long suppression of John's memory, and one that represents a partial reckoning with the past without erasing what was done. John's story also exists within a wider pattern of concealment that the monarchy maintained well into the 20th century. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II and nieces of the Queen Mother, were placed in the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Surrey in 1941 with severe learning difficulties, listed as dead in Burke's Peerage in 1963 while still alive, and not publicly discovered until a tabloid investigation in the 1980s exposed the discrepancy. The impulse across generations was identical: to conceal evidence of disability, to protect the dynastic image, to remove from view those whose existence complicated the narrative of hereditary fitness. Wood Farm did not cease to matter after Prince John's death. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, first took an interest in the farmhouse in the late 1960s, found its practical scale and agricultural setting suited to his temperament in ways the main house did not, and when he retired from public royal duties in August 2017, he moved to Wood Farm full-time, living there alone with minimal staff for most of the period between 2017 and his death at Windsor Castle in April 2021. Most recently, in early 2026, Prince Andrew, stripped of his royal military titles following his associations with Jeffrey Epstein, was reported to have taken up residence at Wood Farm following his enforced departure from Royal Lodge on the Windsor estate. The farmhouse that once sheltered a hidden prince now sheltered an exiled one, its capacity for quiet removal from public life unchanged across a century. Prince John is buried in the graveyard of St Mary Magdalene Church on the Sandringham estate, his grave marked with a simple Celtic stone cross, modest in comparison to the elaborate monuments that mark other royal resting places. His nanny, Charlotte Lala Bill, did not return to royal service after his death, having devoted her professional life, and considerably more than her professional self, to a single child. And when that child was gone, there was nothing further for her within the royal household. Winifred Thomas, the girl from Halifax who visited almost every day, left the Sandringham area after John's death and returned to her own life. She is thought to have married and had children of her own, and her later recollections describe a cheerful boy who laughed easily and kept her company with the straightforward warmth of someone who had never learned to be anything other than himself. The farmhouse where he lived still stands on the Sandringham estate. Its brown brick walls and beige roof are unchanged in their essentials from the structure that sheltered a hidden prince during the years of the First World War. Inside, the open-beamed rooms that once held a boy and his chickens and his letters to his mama have since held a duke in retirement and a prince in disgrace, each generation finding in the building's quiet distance from ceremony a use it has provided since 1916. But beneath all these subsequent layers of occupation, the farmhouse is still, primarily, the place where a 13-year-old boy lived and tended his garden and played with his friend from Halifax and died in his sleep on a January afternoon while his family was 2 miles away. He was not supposed to exist in public. He did not know that. He simply lived. By the mid-1950s, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor had perfected the art of living well at someone else's expense. Their Paris existence centred on the villa at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement in the 16th arrondissement, had settled into a rhythm that would strike most observers as either magnificent or grotesque, depending on their relationship with irony. The villa was not large by the standards of genuine aristocratic excess. Stéphane Boudin of Maison Janson had done something remarkable with its 14 rooms. Boudin was not a name the general public would have recognised, but every serious interior designer in Europe knew it. He was the man who had worked on the interiors at Fontainebleau, who would later advise Jacqueline Kennedy on the White House renovation in 1961, and who brought to residential projects the kind of scholarly rigour usually reserved for museum restorations. For the Windsors, he went further still. The entrance hall ceiling was painted in a style drawn directly from the Villa Palagonia in Palermo, Sicily. That strange 18th-century Sicilian building constructed by Ferdinando Francesco Gravina, Prince of Palagonia, famous throughout southern Europe for its grotesque sculptural program of monsters, dwarfs and mythological hybrids, executed with technical virtuosity and an apparent absence of self-restraint. Such a choice was either deeply considered or faintly self-aware, possibly both. The Duke's bathroom was clad entirely in Carrara marble, a choice that managed to be simultaneously tasteful and ostentatious, which was, in many respects, the Windsor brand-made material. Wallis's bathroom was decorated with blue floral murals conceived and executed by Dmitry Bouchenet, a Russian-born artist of considerable refinement, who had designed textiles and theatrical sets for the Paris couture industry before turning to interior work. His blue florals were gentle and exact, a world away from the Palermo grotesques overhead in the entrance hall, which was part of the point. This house had a personality that shifted room to room, each space making a different argument about who its occupants were. Every room carried Boudin's signature quality of scholarly authenticity. Louis XV armchairs and Louis XVI console tables were not reproductions. They were acquired over years of engagement with Paris's specialist furniture market, pieces that had histories of their own before they arrived here. Silk curtains came in colours that appeared accidental, but required considerable expertise to produce. The accumulated effect, room by room, was of a house that had been curated rather than decorated, not a home assembled for comfort, but an aesthetic argument assembled for permanence. Objects accumulated across 30 years formed a staggering collection. Silver from Asprey occupied the side tables. Paintings by Edgar Degas and Édouard Villard hung in the reception rooms. Furniture that had once graced chateaux redistributed across 3 centuries of French political upheaval arrived here through the specialist dealers of the 7th arrondissement, each piece carrying its own interrupted history. Every surface carried something significant. The cumulative statement was not of a home, but of a counter-argument made entirely in objects. We belong here, we have always belonged here, the abdication was their mistake, not ours. Running the household required substantial staff. A full-time team of gardeners maintained the grounds. Running the house itself required 8 to 10 domestic staff at any given time, including a French chef of professional distinction, and a Scottish butler who served as a daily reminder of a country the Windsors were not permitted to return to, without prior approval. Wallis dressed exclusively in Paris couture, primarily Christian Dior, but also Hubert de Givenchy and Pierre Balmain. Her wardrobe occupied dedicated rooms. That jewellery collection, which Sotheby's would eventually assess at 53.6 million Swiss francs, went on regular public outings as necklaces, brooches and bracelets at the dinner parties that structured the Windsor social calendar. Those parties were the second architecture of their Paris life, constructed with as much care as Boudin's interiors. The Windsors entertained with sustained intensity. Politicians, journalists, socialites, minor royals from displaced European houses, American industrialists with sufficient money and sufficient curiosity to make the transatlantic trip worthwhile. Invitations were returned in kind across Paris and wider Europe. They dined with the Rothschilds. Evenings with the Aga Khan were a fixture. Friendships were maintained with Cole Porter, whose dry wit matched the Duchess's own, and Noel Coward, who observed the Windsor marriage with the affectionate precision of a man who understood complicated arrangements at close range. The friendship with Jimmy Donoghue, the Woolworth heir, was considerably less comfortable. His relationship with the Duchess during the early 1950s generated pointed gossip in Parisian social circles, and the Duke made a considered decision not to act on what he noticed. Historians have suggested this was a pattern in his management of the marriage, and the evidence supports them. The Bois de Boulogne provided the backdrop for the more sedate pleasures. Daily walks with the pugs were a fixture, the dogs changing over the decades but the walks remaining constant, a ritual that gave the day its shape. Golf at the Racing Club de France offered the Duke a competitive structure that his public role had once provided on a far grander scale. Paris's quality of civic indifference suited them precisely. The city had agreed, as a matter of informal policy, to allow a former British king his privacy, and it kept to that agreement. The French were unsentimental about other nations' constitutional crises. Enough of their own had accumulated over 2 centuries to diminish the novelty. The French arrangement extended well beyond nominal rent, exemption from French income tax, a privilege of considerable financial significance given the scale of their combined income, was part of the deal. Access to tax-free goods through the British Embassy reduced their living costs further. The lease on 4 Route Duchamp d'Entraînement had been made available in 1953, when Charles de Gaulle vacated the property following his residence there between 1946 and 1953. Such symbolism of a former British king occupying the house most recently held by the architect of Free France was not entirely lost on the informed observer. Nobody mentioned it in the Windsors' hearing. At Gif-sur-Yvette, approximately 25 miles southwest of Paris in the Chevreuse Valley, they kept Moulin de la Tuilerie, a country house built around an old mill that served as their weekend and summer retreat, a private counterpoint to the formal grandeur of the Paris villa. Boudin had worked here too, though with a lighter hand. The Tuileries retained something of the character of a working farm property, converted and embellished rather than transformed. The Duke gave the Tuileries his closest personal attention. He gardened obsessively at Gif-sur-Yvette, designing beds, directing plantings, maintaining the grounds with the focused engagement of a man who had found in horticulture what his political circumstances had otherwise denied him. Something to tend, something that grew or failed according to his efforts, something that actually responded. For the Duke, the Paris years were comfortable in ways that occasionally shaded into something considerably darker. He had been, at his peak in the 1920s, the most famous man in the world, the Prince of Wales, whose tours of the empire drew hundreds of thousands into the streets of Melbourne, New Delhi and Washington. By the mid-1950s, he wrote his memoirs, gave occasional carefully managed interviews, played golf, attended parties, maintained a vast correspondence, and gardened. No office was held and no function was exercised. The house, for all its beauty, was a magnificent way of not being anywhere that mattered. Bessie Wallace Warfield was born on June 19, 1895, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, to Teakle Wallace Warfield and Alice Montague. Her father died when she was 5 months old. His death left her mother dependent on the charitable assistance of relatives in Baltimore, which was not an unusual position in the social world of Maryland's genteel but straitened upper middle class at the turn of the century. but it was a formative one. Growing up acutely conscious of money, of its absence, and of how precisely it defined social position, Wallis developed early and comprehensive understanding of what a woman without independent means was required to be. Simultaneously charming and strategic, capable of deploying warmth and intelligence in the service of social advancement, without allowing either to become liabilities. She was educated at Oldfield School in Glencoe, Maryland, a finishing school whose stated mission was the production of accomplished young women capable of moving without friction through the upper registers of American society. The school motto was, "Gentleness and courtesy are expected of everyone at all times," which Wallis absorbed selectively. Moving through social registers came to her with unusual ease. She was not conventionally beautiful. She was angular, with strong hands and a jaw that the camera found unforgiving, and a personal style that was entirely constructed rather than natural. Her conversational intelligence was, by the accounts of everyone who knew her in those years, exceptional. Social antennae were finely calibrated to the frequencies that mattered. Which people had real influence? Which obligations were worth accepting? Which kinds of attention were worth cultivating? And which were worth deflecting? Her first marriage in November 1916 was to Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., a United States Navy aviator. Spencer had the surface attractions of his type: handsome, decorated, with the ease of a man accustomed to being found appealing. The interior was less promising. He was a serious and escalating alcoholic by the early years of the marriage, and his volatility made their household, as they moved through successive naval postings across the United States, and eventually to the Far East, a place of sustained instability. They separated repeatedly. Spencer was eventually posted to China, and Wallis followed intermittently, spending extended periods in Shanghai and Peking between 1924 and 1926. The China years have attracted an extraordinary volume of biographical speculation, most of it unprovable, and a meaningful portion of it demonstrably false. Various theories have circulated about Wallis's activities in Shanghai's international settlement during those years. Sexual adventures of a specific and lurid nature, possible intelligence connections, a particular skill allegedly acquired in the establishments of a certain kind that operated in the French concession. Most of this material cannot be substantiated. Some of it originated in documents later identified as fabrications. What is substantiated is more interesting than the mythology. She spent 2 years in one of the most cosmopolitan and politically complex cities in the world, moving through the international social set that clustered around Shanghai's clubs and embassies during a period of intense geopolitical pressure. Back in the United States, she had refined, in challenging conditions, her understanding of how to manage men of considerable ego, status anxiety, and need. This understanding would prove, within a decade, to be the most consequential skill she possessed. She divorced Spencer in 1927 in Warrenton, Virginia. Her second marriage, in July 1928, was to Ernest Aldrich Simpson, Anglo-American by background, Harvard-educated, British by naturalization, and employed in the family shipping firm. Ernest was stable, prosperous, and socially ambitious, in the quiet, London-based manner of a man who had made his money and wished to spend it agreeably. His business connections and social ambitions placed the Simpsons squarely in the upper reaches of London society by the early 1930s. Through Lady Thelma Furness, the Connecticut-born companion of the Prince of Wales and a regular in the Prince's set at Fort Belvedere, Wallis was introduced to the Prince of Wales at a house party in Melton Mowbray in January 1931. The introduction was unremarkable. Wallis did not immediately displace Lady Furness, who remained the Prince's principal companion through 1933. By late 1933, the position was shifting. By early 1934, Wallis had become a fixture of the Fort Belvedere social set, invited with increasing frequency, treated with a deference by the Prince's household that the courtiers around him noted and did not know how to address. Lady Furness made the strategic error of travelling to the United States in early 1934 and, on her own subsequent account, asking Wallis to look after the prince during her absence. What happened during that absence was not ambiguous. By the time Lady Furness returned to London, the position had been settled without a formal announcement of any kind. What precisely did the Prince of Wales see in Wallis Simpson? This question has occupied biographers for 80 years without generating a consensus. She made him feel, by every contemporaneous account, like the most intellectually interesting person in his immediate vicinity. Speaking to him with a directness that no English woman of comparable social standing would have risked, she criticised his choices before he acted on them, challenged his opinions before he adopted them publicly, and declined the automatic deference that every other figure in his world provided as a baseline. For a man who had spent his entire adult life being the most famous person in any room while consistently feeling that nobody was genuinely interested in what he thought, Wallis Simpson was an overwhelming experience. His family and advisers would come to believe it was a dependency disguised as an attachment. The evidence, assembled over subsequent decades, does not entirely contradict that interpretation. By January 1936, when Edward ascended to the throne as King Edward VIII following the death of George V on January 20th, Wallis Simpson had become the most discussed woman in British establishment circles, not because the British public knew her name, but because the British government, the court and the senior church hierarchy were acutely and anxiously familiar with the situation. The American and European press had been writing about the relationship openly for months. Britain's own press maintained a gentleman's agreement of editorial self-censorship. That silence had a finite lifespan, and everyone involved understood this. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, known within his family as David, had been for most of his adult life the most celebrated prince in the world. The assessment requires no qualification. From his first major overseas tour in 1920, when he visited Australia, New Zealand and Canada to receptions of a fervour that periodicals struggled to describe adequately, to his accession to the throne in January 1936, he was received in dominions, colonies and foreign capitals with a public enthusiasm that bore no relationship to the reality of his character or the nature of his political views. Crowds turned out in the hundreds of thousands across 4 continents. Newspapers devoted front pages to his arrivals. Young women in quantities that alarmed local police departments developed passions for him that the social media of the period, meaning the tabloid press, documented with cheerful irresponsibility. He was, in his youth, physically compelling, slight and fair, with an openness of expression that read in photographs and on newsreel as accessibility rather than superficiality. Clothes were worn with genuine instinctive confidence, making him a constant of fashion journalism and the original model for the Prince of Wales check pattern. His tours of the empire were understood, in the early 1920s, as evidence that the monarchy could be renewed and made relevant to the millions of subjects who had fought in the trenches on its behalf, and returned to unemployment, inadequate housing and diminished prospects. He appeared to be genuinely interested in ordinary people and their difficulties, which distinguished him from most members of his class and all members of his immediate family. The famous visit to Douai in November 1936, during which he observed the devastation wrought by the collapse of the steel industry and said something must be done to a group of unemployed workers, was a genuine expression of sympathy rather than a calculated political gesture. That phrase was remembered and repeated in Welsh mining communities for decades after his abdication, which tells you something about the depth of the connection he established with working-class Britain, and something about the waste involved in the constitutional crisis that ended his reign. Beneath the public image, those who worked closely with him across the 1920s and into the 1930s observed a character considerably less reassuring than the public version. He was impatient with paperwork and with the formal mechanisms of constitutional monarchy, treating the red boxes of government documents as obstacles to his social calendar, rather than as the core responsibility of his office. His private secretaries, men of considerable ability and long experience, found him resistant to counsel in ways that ranged from maddening to genuinely alarming. Where his father, George V, had been dutiful to the point of rigidity, treating the institutional apparatus of monarchy as a sacred obligation, Edward was casual to the point of constitutional negligence. His political views made the personal failings considerably more serious. He was publicly and privately sympathetic to Germany in the years of the National Socialist government, consistently inclined to attribute German rearmament to the punitive nature of the Versailles settlement, rather than to the ideology of the regime conducting it. Collective security arrangements left him sceptical. The League of Nations dismissible, and Soviet communism was, in his honest assessment, the primary threat to European civilization, far more so than German fascism. These views were not, in 1935, unique to him. They were shared by a substantial portion of the British aristocracy and a significant fraction of the Conservative Party. They were, however, becoming rapidly incompatible with the role of a constitutional sovereign, as the character of the decade clarified. Fort Belvedere, the castellated grace and favour house in Windsor Great Park that he had occupied since 1929, was the physical expression of who he actually was when the institutional obligations were temporarily suspended, informal, social, modern in its comforts, wholly his own. Wallis Simpson was a regular presence at Fort Belvedere from 1934 onwards. The court household noted this with increasing anxiety. Queen Mary, his mother, visited Fort Belvedere precisely once, and found it, in the language of the period, most uncongenial. The feeling, by most accounts, was mutual. A constitutional crisis of 1936 turned on a specific and immovable legal and ecclesiastical problem. The Church of England, of which the King was supreme governor, did not permit the remarriage of divorced persons in cases where a former spouse was still living. Wallis's first husband, Earl Winfield Spencer, was alive. Her second husband, Ernest Simpson, would not be divorced until October 27, 1936. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin informed the King in October 1936 that the government could not support a marriage to Mrs. Simpson under any circumstances, and that if the King proceeded, the government would resign, triggering a general election in which the constitutional fitness of the monarchy itself would be a central question. Baldwin was not, in practice, offering a negotiation. A conclusion was being presented, not a discussion. The King explored alternatives with the energy of a man who had not yet accepted that the alternatives had already been eliminated. A morganatic marriage, in which Wallis would be his wife without being his queen, was proposed by the King and considered by the Cabinet, which consulted the Dominion governments, which returned responses of uniform clarity. Num Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, was not available for theological accommodation. Press silence broke in the first week of December, and public opinion, when it finally encountered the reality of the situation, was not the reservoir of sympathy the King had expected. On December 10, 1936, Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication in the presence of his three brothers at Fort Belvedere. His broadcast to the nation on the evening of December 11th, transmitted from Windsor Castle, was heard by an estimated audience of several 100 million people worldwide. He explained that he could not carry the heavy burden of royal responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved. It was one of the most effective speeches of the 20th century. Hundreds of millions of people were moved to sympathise with a man who had walked away from the most powerful constitutional office in the British structure, abandoned his country during a period of gathering European crisis, and handed his brother a problem neither man had wanted or prepared for. His brother, now George VI, did not forgive him quickly for any of it. The financial architecture of the abdication was constructed under considerable pressure and in considerable haste, and it was designed from the outset to benefit the Crown rather than the man vacating it, though it was arranged with sufficient generosity to keep that imbalance from becoming a public scandal. Edward had accumulated substantial private assets during his adult life. Sandringham, the Norfolk estate that George V had held as private property, had passed to Edward on his father's death in January 1936 as a personal inheritance rather than a Crown asset. Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park had been occupied on a grace and favour lease since 1929. His investments and liquid assets were considerable, though their precise value was disputed between the parties involved in the abdication settlement, and has been disputed by historians ever since. The negotiation of what happened to these assets was handled with the discretion appropriate to a transaction that both sides preferred not to have scrutinised publicly. Edward sold Sandringham and Balmoral to his brother George VI. Royal Secretary Alan Lascelles described the sum paid for these properties as colossal, which is a characterisation historians have found interesting, precisely because it acknowledges the scale of the transaction while declining to specify it. The phrase colossal sum appears in the historical record without an accompanying figure, which may reflect genuine sensitivity about the numbers, or may reflect the fact that Lascelles, who disliked Edward intensely, found it useful to suggest the transaction was more generous than it was. What is clear is that Edward emerged from the abdication with sufficient capital to sustain a comfortable private life without dependence on any single income source. George VI also agreed to pay his brother an annuity of £25,000 per year, tax-free. At 1936 values, this represented a substantial income, roughly equivalent to an annual income of approximately £1.8 million in contemporary terms. The arrangement carried an implicit condition that was not made public. The Duke was not to return to Britain without the King's explicit permission. Both parties understood this, and neither party publicly acknowledged it. The question of Wallis's status was handled with considerably less generosity and considerably more deliberate cruelty. George VI, acting on the advice of his mother Queen Mary and the constitutional machinery that had spent most of 1936 attempting to prevent the marriage, issued letters patent on June 27, 1937, the eve of the wedding at the Château de Cande. These letters patent specified that the title His Royal Highness applied to the Duke of Windsor, but not to his wife. Wallis would be styled Her Grace the Duchess of Windsor. She would not be Her Royal Highness. The distinction mattered in precise and calculated ways. In the formal hierarchy of royal protocol, where precedence and title governed every aspect of public life, from seating arrangements to ceremonial positioning, Wallis would be required to curtsy to any member of the royal family who held HRH status, including those of considerably less historical consequence than the wife of a former king. The denial was calibrated to be felt at every formal occasion for the rest of her life. This decision was never reversed, not under George VI, who imposed it, not under Queen Elizabeth II, who inherited it, not at any point during the remaining 49 years of Wallis's life. Queen Mary, who had given her own life entirely to the institution and who had watched her son dismantle a constitutional arrangement she considered sacred, believed that Wallis Simpson had destroyed everything she cared about. She was not wrong about the destruction. Rewarding it with a royal title was not something she was prepared to do. Her mark on the arrangement remained for 5 decades. The wedding took place on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Cande in Touraine, lent to them by Charles Badeau, a Franco-American industrialist who had made his fortune from a system of industrial time and motion management, and who had, as was becoming increasingly apparent to the intelligence services of several countries, extensive business connections in National Socialist Germany. No member of the British royal family attended. Britain's Church of England declined to provide a clergyman for a ceremony involving a divorced person marrying a man whose former wife was still living. The service was conducted by the Reverend Robert Anderson Jardine, a Church of England vicar from Darlington who officiated against the explicit wishes of the Bishop of Durham and was subsequently ostracised by the ecclesiastical establishment for doing so. Before arriving at the Château de Cande, Edward had spent the months following the abdication at the castle of Enzisfeld in Austria, a property lent to him by Baroness Kitty de Rothschild. He and Wallis had been separated for nearly 6 months between the abdication in December 1936 and the wedding in June 1937, communicating by telephone in calls monitored by British intelligence. The early years of their exile were spent in rented properties rather than owned ones. Villa La Croix at Cap d'Antibes on the French Riviera served as their principal base between 1938 and 1949, a handsome white house above the Mediterranean that suited Wallace's taste for formal entertaining. It was also approximately 800 miles from London, which suited everyone else involved. The decision of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor to tour Nazi Germany in October 1937 was, assessed with the benefit of hindsight, one of the more spectacular acts of political misjudgment committed by a member of any royal house in the 20th century. At the time, it was framed by the Duke's circle as a private educational visit, an industrial and social fact-finding mission focused on German housing conditions and labour organisation. German officials received it as an enormous propaganda windfall and an implicit endorsement from a former British king of the National Socialist project. The tour ran from October 12th to October 22nd, 1937. Travelling on Hitler's personal train, the Führer-Sonderzug required either a remarkable failure of political imagination or a very deliberate statement of alignment. The itinerary covered Berlin, Munich, Dresden, and the industrial Ruhr region. They inspected housing projects. Included in the programme were the Krupp armaments works at Essen, one of the central engines of German rearmament, and the Duke expressed admiration for the organisation and efficiency of what he observed. Over the course of the tour, they dined with Joseph Goebbels, Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Albert Speer. A state dinner was hosted by Rudolf Hess, the Deputy Führer. The social programme covered the full complement of senior National Socialist leadership, with a thoroughness that left very little room for the interpretation that the tour was politically neutral. At Berchtesgaden on October 22nd, the Duke and Duchess were received by Adolf Hitler at the Berghof, his alpine residence above the town. The meeting lasted approximately 1 hour. Photographs of the Duke's full Nazi salute on greeting Hitler were widely published. Paul Schmidt, Hitler's personal interpreter, was present throughout and produced a record of the conversation. According to accounts reconstructed from contemporaneous German documents, the Duke told Hitler, "The Germans and the British races are one, they should always be one." Hitler, through Schmidt, expressed his gratitude and his hope for a permanent friendship between the two nations. Neither party appeared to find any aspect of this exchange inappropriate. Charles Bedeau, who had lent them the Château de Conde for the wedding 4 months earlier, had organised the German tour. This was not a coincidence. Bedeau had extensive business interests in Germany, maintained personal relationships with senior figures in the National Socialist Economic Ministry, and was, in the terminology of contemporary intelligence services, an asset of uncertain but significant loyalty to multiple parties simultaneously. American authorities arrested him in 1943 on charges of trading with the enemy and conducting business interests in German-occupied France. He died in custody in Miami in February 1944, before trial. The immediate consequences of the German tour were not apparent in their full severity. Back in France, the Windsors resumed their social life as though nothing had occurred beyond a successful foreign visit. What was happening simultaneously in the intelligence apparatus of Britain, France, and later the United States, was the steady accumulation of a file on the Duke that would eventually constitute one of the more damaging bodies of evidence compiled against a member of any European royal house in modern history. The Marburg files were a collection of captured German Foreign Ministry documents recovered by Allied forces from Marburg Castle in Germany in 1945. These files contained extensive material relating to the Duke of Windsor, including internal German assessments of his political sympathies, records of his various contacts with German officials, and documentation of a specific operational plan. That plan, known in internal German communications as Operation Willy, had been active during the summer of 1940, in the weeks following the collapse of France. Its objective was to induce the Duke who was at that point moving through neutral Spain and Portugal to remain in the Iberian Peninsula and to keep himself available as a puppet monarch for a post-invasion Britain or a negotiated peace settlement favourable to Germany. Documentation in the files indicated that German intelligence believed the Duke was, at minimum, not decisively opposed to such an arrangement. FBI files on the Duke of Windsor, compiled under J. Edgar Hoover's direction and partially declassified over subsequent decades, contained additional and considerably more specific allegations. According to these reports, during the Duke's passage through Spain and Portugal in June and July 1940, as he was evacuated from occupied France ahead of the German advance, he had communicated British military dispositions and intelligence assessments to German intermediaries. These allegations were never formally proven. The Duke denied them, consistently and with evident conviction, for the remainder of his life. They were, however, sufficiently credible to shape a significant decision by the British government. Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister in May 1940 and who was conducting the most consequential political and military operation in British history, wrote to the Duke in August 1940 with characteristic directness. He informed the Duke that remaining in Europe in any capacity would make him what Churchill described as a centre for Nazi intrigue. The Duke had been pressing, through every channel available to him, for an appointment in Britain or in some European capacity that would allow him to contribute to the war effort. Churchill declined to provide any such appointment and instead offered the governorship of the Bahamas. No decoding was required. The posting placed the Duke and Duchess 6,000 miles from London, on a collection of islands whose principal economic activities were modest tourism and, until recently, rum-running to Prohibition-era Americans. Nassau's population stood at approximately 70,000. Annual colonial budget would not have funded a minor British municipal authority. That appointment was the political equivalent of a very comfortable filing cabinet, and everyone involved understood its function. The Duke accepted because Churchill had ensured that no alternative appointment was available, and refusing would have confirmed publicly the worst of what was already being said about him in private. Government House Nassau had been built in 1737 on a hillside above Nassau Harbour, and it looked like a building that had not been seriously attended to since. When the Duke and Duchess arrived in August 1940, they found a residence Wallis Simpson described, in a letter to her Aunt Bessie Merriman shortly after arrival, as "Our St. Helena." The reference was precise and deliberate. St. Helena was the South Atlantic island to which the British had exiled Napoleon following Waterloo, chosen for its absolute remoteness from any theatre of influence. The analogy was not intended as a compliment to the British government, and it was understood as such by those in London who read the letter, which included several people it had not been addressed to. Its physical condition required substantial remediation. The roof was inadequate, with consequent effects on the rooms below during the rainy season. Kitchen appliances appeared to date from the previous century. Rooms were damp, the furnishings a collection of mismatched colonial furniture from several generations of previous incumbents, and the complete absence of air conditioning was, in Nassau's tropical heat and humidity, a condition of daily physical suffering for the Duchess in particular. Wallis addressed these deficiencies with the same focused competence she brought to all domestic projects. Art Deco furnishings were sourced to give Government House a visual coherence it had never previously possessed. She installed air conditioning, the first system ever fitted in a British colonial government residence, a fact that requires some reflection on the priorities of those who had previously occupied the position. Renovating the kitchen to professional standards and importing a French chef followed. By 1941, Government House Nassau was a substantially more functional and considerably more attractive building than it had been on their arrival. The Duke administered the Bahamas with a mixture of genuine effort and consistent misjudgment. His official duties were not intellectually demanding, and he applied himself to aspects that engaged him: improving housing conditions for Bahamian workers, promoting economic development through American investment, managing the increasingly complex relationship with the United States as American involvement in the Atlantic War developed. Administrative competence was present in areas where his personal inclinations aligned with the work. He was, however, entirely unable to set aside an ideological framework that had been formed in the 1930s and that consistently distorted his reading of social and political situations. In June 1942, workers employed on a construction project at Oaks Field, the new airfield being built to American military specifications, went on strike over wages and conditions. The dispute was not complicated. The workers were being paid significantly less than the American set minimum wage that governed workers on the American side of the project. Workers escalated the dispute into riots across Nassau, attacking businesses, setting fires in the Bay Street commercial district, and clashing with police. 2 people were killed, and the financial damage was considerable. The Duke's official report to London described the riots as the product of communist agitation, a characterization not supported by any intelligence assessment then available. He called in troops from Trinidad to restore order. His analysis of the underlying structural problems was, according to subsequent historical assessments by scholars of Bahamian history, superficial and self-serving. London was dissatisfied with his handling of the situation, but London was conducting a global military operation and had limited appetite for a public dispute with the most embarrassing member of its colonial hierarchy. The murder of Sir Harry Oakes on the morning of July 8, 1943, was a more serious affair, and the Duke's management of it became one of the more thoroughly documented administrative failures of the colonial period. Oakes was the wealthiest private individual in the Bahamas, a Canadian-born mining millionaire who had made his fortune at the Kirkland Lake gold mine in Ontario, had moved his tax residence to the Bahamas to avoid Canadian and American taxation, and had acquired substantial property interests across the island group. He was found at his estate, Westbourne, having been beaten and then set on fire. He was 68 years old. The murder was of obvious complexity. Oakes had financial entanglements with numerous parties, including Harold Christie, the Bahamian property developer who claimed to have discovered the body, and with various figures in the Caribbean gambling and hotel industries. Exercising executive authority that was constitutionally questionable and practically disastrous, declined to summon Scotland Yard. Instead, he contacted Captain Edward Melchin and Captain James Barker of the Miami Police Department, officers who were acquainted with the Duke through his social connections but who were not equipped, by training or experience, for a murder investigation of this complexity. Suspicion was focused on Alfred de Marigny, a French-Mauritian socialite who had married Oakes's eldest daughter, Nancy, against Oakes's strong objection. The case against de Marigny rested substantially on a fingerprint that Barker claimed to have lifted from a bedside screen in Oakes's room. Subsequent forensic examination by defence experts indicated the fingerprint had been transferred to the screen from another surface after the fact. De Marigny was acquitted by the jury in November 1943, after a trial that had exposed the investigation's inadequacies in considerable public detail. The judge directed him to leave the Bahamas immediately following the verdict. No conviction was ever secured. The investigation had been so comprehensively compromised by the Miami detectives' methods that any subsequent forensic reconstruction was impossible. No accusation of criminal involvement in the murder attached to the Duke, but his handling of the investigation was criticised publicly and at length in the American press, with criticism reaching London through official channels already inclined to view the Bahamas governorship as a problem rather than an asset. Nassau was vacated by the Windsors in May 1945 when the governorship formally ended. No subsequent appointment was offered. The exile continued in a different location with the same structural conditions. The arrangement that gave the Windsors their Paris home was, in its architectural clarity, almost elegant. The city of Paris, acting on the recommendation of the French government, made available the villa at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement on terms the French administration described as a nominal lease, and that, in practice, constituted rent so close to zero that the distinction was largely theoretical. Occupying a superb position, adjacent to the Bois de Boulogne in the 16th arrondissement, the most prestigious residential district in Paris, convenient to the Racing Club de France and to the diplomatic quarter, insulated by mature trees from the casual observation of passers-by. Its previous occupant had been General Charles de Gaulle, who had used it as his private Paris residence from 1946 until 1953. The sequence of occupancy merits a moment's consideration. De Gaulle had lived at this address during his years of political withdrawal following the resignation of his provisional government in January 1946, when he stepped back from the constitutional arrangements he had helped construct and waited for France to realise it needed him. In 1953, when the city of Paris sought a new occupant of appropriate distinction, the option it settled on was a former British king, whose abdication had been driven in part by political sympathies that de Gaulle would have found contemptible. Neither party made public comment on the juxtaposition. Roger Bouvard had designed the original villa between 1928 and 1929 for Henri Lillas, a wealthy private client with no subsequent historical significance. The design was French neoclassical in the restrained mode of the late 1920s, well-proportioned, carefully fenestrated, built to announce taste rather than money, which is the considerably more expensive announcement to make convincingly. 14 rooms on 2 principal floors, adequate grounds for a formal and kitchen garden, and a walled perimeter provided effective privacy from the Bois de Boulogne's constant traffic of joggers, cyclists, and horse riders. Stéphane Boudin of Maison Janson began work on the interiors in 1952, with successive phases of work continuing through the late 1950s as specific rooms were addressed and refined. Maison Janson had been the premier Paris decorating firm since the late 19th century, with a client list that spanned the Élysée Palace, the mansions of the Parisian haute bourgeoisie, and the grand projects of European and South American plutocracy. Boudin's personal approach was historically grounded to an unusual degree even within that context. He did not reproduce historical styles so much as reconstruct them from primary sources, working with original period pieces or with reproductions of documentary accuracy that required specialist expertise to identify as such. For the entrance hall, Boudin looked to the Villa Palagonia in Palermo for his ceiling programme. That Palagonia villa, completed in 1737 for Ferdinando Francesco Gravina, is one of the stranger survivals of 18th century European architecture. Its ceilings and exterior sculpture feature a dense population of grotesque figures, hybrid creatures, and distorted human forms executed with considerable technical skill and apparent Baroque exuberance. In the Windsor entrance hall, these Palagonia references produced a ceiling that was exuberant and faintly unsettling in equal measure, which may or may not have been Boudin's intention. It announced very clearly that this was not a house decorated by people who played safe. The Duke's bathroom was lined entirely in Carrara marble, white, cold, immaculate, expensive, and slightly institutional in the way that floor-to-ceiling marble tends to be. Wallace's bathroom was a more decorative proposition, with the blue floral programme by Dimitri Bouchenet covering the walls in a composition that drew from Bouchenet's textile and theatrical design background. He had been a significant figure in the Paris fashion world of the 1930s, designing prints and stage sets before the war disrupted the industry. His work for the Duchess's bathroom was personal in its scale and intimate in its effect, the kind of commission that a designer accepts when the client's brief is, "Make it feel like no other room in Paris." The main reception rooms followed Boudin's programme of French royal furniture, period Louis XV and Louis XVI pieces, not reproductions, sourced through years of careful attention to the Paris specialist furniture market, and the auction rooms of the Hôtel Drouot. Quality was verifiable, the provenance in some cases impeccable, and the arrangement of the pieces within the rooms demonstrated the kind of instinct for proportion and colour balance that cannot be taught. Silk curtains in the salon were, according to visitors who wrote about them, a colour that had no precise name, but that was right in a way immediately apparent and nearly impossible to explain. The house had features that were less aesthetically concerned. Several rooms were connected by passages not immediately apparent from the principal floor plan, giving the house an interior geography slightly more complex than its exterior suggested. A room described in various accounts as a safe room occupied a position on the ground floor that would have been structurally sensible for the purpose. Beneath the ground floor, accessible via a passage that did not feature on the plans filed with the city of Paris, was a nuclear fallout shelter. Installing residential fallout shelters in Paris was not unknown during the late 1950s and early 1960s, when Soviet medium-range missile capability made Paris a credible target, and wealthy Parisians with private construction budgets were taking precautions. Whether the Windsor shelter was installed on the initiative of the Duke himself, the French government, or some other party remains undocumented. At Gif-sur-Yvette, in the Chevreuse Valley, approximately 25 miles southwest of Paris, Moulin de la Tuileries served as the emotional counterpart to the formal grandeur of the Paris villa. The Duke had taken direct personal involvement in its renovation and garden design from the outset of the 1952 lease. Boudin was consulted here too, but the Tuileries retained the character of what it was, a working mill house of the 17th century, converted for domestic use without losing the rough surfaces and agricultural bones that made it feel genuinely inhabited rather than constructed. The Duke gardened at Gif-sur-Yvette with serious personal investment, planning beds and directing the planting of trees that he was fully aware he might not live to see mature. His memoir, A King's Story, published in 1951 to considerable commercial success, had provided income that supplemented the £25,000 annual annuity from George VI. Both income sources combined, set against French tax exemption on both, gave the Windsors a financial situation considerably more comfortable than their official status as private citizens without gainful employment might have implied. The French government had, in practice, underwritten the Windsor exile with fiscal generosity that served French interests as well as British ones. A former British king residing in Paris, visible but discreet, socially active but politically inert, was a useful ornament for a republic that had always found the British monarchy simultaneously fascinating and faintly absurd. From the perspective of the British royal family, the arrangement was an extremely reasonable price. The Duke of Windsor was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1972. He had smoked heavily across most of his adult life, a habit that photographs document from at least the early 1920s, and the diagnosis was not a surprise to those who had observed his health through the preceding years. By the spring of 1972, he was largely confined to his room at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement, receiving oxygen, visibly diminished from the trim and energetic figure of his public years. On May 18, 1972, Queen Elizabeth II arrived at the villa with Prince Philip during a state visit to France. She came to the house to see her uncle. It was the first substantive personal contact between the Duke and the senior members of the British royal family since the abdication 36 years earlier, or as close to the first as the diplomatic record permits. There had been the funeral of George VI in February 1952, attended by the Duke, but managed in a manner designed to minimise any sustained interaction. This May 1972 visit was different. It was deliberate, documented and photographed in the garden of the villa with a clarity that made the moment legible as what it was, a farewell managed with appropriate institutional efficiency. The Duke was brought downstairs and into the garden for the photographs. She appeared composed, as she invariably did, the composure in this case carrying more weight than usual. Frail and noticeably diminished, still wearing his customary tie and suit with the instinct of a man for whom personal presentation had never been a matter of choice, the Duke stood for the photographs. Prince Philip stood slightly apart, as he habitually did in situations of family complexity. The visit lasted approximately 35 minutes. It was the last time the Queen and the Duke of Windsor were in the same room. He died 10 days later, on May 28, 1972, at the Villa, in the house the French government had provided at nominal rent 19 years earlier, and where he had lived out the longest and most decorated phase of his exile at 77 years old. His body was flown to England, where he lay in state at St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, with 57,000 members of the public filing past the coffin over 2 days. Burial followed in the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore in Windsor Great Park, in a plot allocated by the royal family, with space provided beside him for the Duchess. The Duchess was brought to England for the funeral by the royal family, travelling from Paris and staying at Buckingham Palace, which represented the closest she had come to the institution since the abdication. She attended the service. Immediately after, she returned to France. Over the following 14 years, she disappeared, from the perspective of the public and of most of her former social world, almost entirely. What happened during those years was not a comfortable story. Wallis's health declined progressively through the 1970s. Her mental acuity, which had been the most reliable instrument she possessed throughout her life, began to fail. The social world that had sustained her, the dinner parties, the couture, the jewellery, the constant maintenance of relationships across 2 continents, required energy and cognitive clarity she could no longer command. Into this vacancy stepped Maître Suzanne Blum. Maître Blum was 73 years old when the Duke died in 1972. A French lawyer of genuine and considerable distinction, she had represented Charlie Chaplin in his battles with American immigration authorities, acted for Jack Warner, appeared for Rita Hayworth in various proceedings, and conducted international commercial arbitration at the highest level across a career spanning 5 decades. She had been the Windsor's Paris lawyer since the 1940s, had managed their relationship with the French government on the villa lease and on various fiscal arrangements, and knew their affairs with an intimacy that extended well beyond the purely legal. Following the Duke's death, her role expanded, by stages, from legal advisor to effective guardian. Access to the Duchess was progressively restricted. Friends who had known Wallis for 30 or 40 years found themselves unable to obtain visits, their requests managed by Maître Blum's office, or not responded to at all. Journalist and author Michael Bloch, who worked as Maître Blum's research assistant and editorial collaborator in the late 1970s and early 1980s, producing a series of books drawn from Windsor archive material, provided the most sustained and detailed account of this period in his subsequent memoir. His account described a woman who, by the early 1980s, was effectively isolated within her own residence, cared for medically, maintained in physical comfort by the infrastructure of the villa, but cut off from the social connections that had constituted her existence. In 1980, the Duchess suffered a fall that was followed by a cerebral episode, leaving her largely bedridden and, for extended periods, incapable of coherent communication. Her final years were spent at the villa, attended by nurses, occasionally visited by Maître Blum, and by very few others. Boudin's meticulously conceived rooms, with their Asprey silver and Louis XIV furniture, surrounded a woman who could no longer see them. Wallis Simpson, Duchess of Windsor, died on April 24, 1986. Aged 89, she was buried at Frogmore, as the Duke had wished, and as the royal family had arranged, beside her husband in the Royal Burial Ground, maintained by the Crown. Her grave is tended by royal household staff. It receives no special public attention, exactly where the institution wanted her in the end. Wallis Simpson had been the most extensively jewelled private woman in Europe, and that collection required disposal. Sotheby's was the chosen instrument, and the result was one of the most commercially significant auction events of the 20th century, produced by a woman who had died after 14 years of managed isolation in the very house the auctions would subsequently dismantle. The jewels of the Duchess of Windsor opened at Sotheby's Geneva sale room on the evening of April 9, 1987. The catalogue listed 228 lots, representing the accumulation of 35 years of giving by a man who expressed what he felt in Cartier and Van Cleef and Arpels because the institutional framework of his life had denied him most of the other conventional forms of expression. Pieces ranged from Edwardian sentimental items acquired in the early years of the marriage to extraordinary one-of-a-kind commissions that the major houses had produced specifically for the Duchess, and that had no equivalent in private collections anywhere. The Wittelsbach diamond brooch sold for 7.92 million Swiss francs, setting a record for a brooch at auction that stood for years. Cartier's Windsor necklace, an architectural piece of considerable technical complexity and aesthetic authority, went for 4.76 million Swiss francs to Robert Mouawad, the Lebanese-Swiss jeweller and collector who was bidding aggressively throughout the 3 days. A Van Cleef and Arpels bracelet realised 2.98 million Swiss francs. Cartier's Edward corsage ornament, commissioned in the early years of the marriage as a gift from the Duke to mark an occasion, the auction catalogue declined to specify, sold for 2.45 million Swiss francs. When the hammer fell on the final lot on April 11th, the total had reached 53.6 million Swiss francs, approximately $30.7 million US dollars at prevailing exchange rates. Every estimate published in the pre-sale catalogue had been exceeded. Several had been exceeded by margins that the Sotheby's specialists found difficult to explain even in retrospect. On April 12th, the day following the close of the jewellery sale, Sotheby's conducted a separate auction of the Duchess's couture wardrobe. 500-plus pieces, primarily by Christian Dior, but including significant quantities from Pierre Balmain and Hubert de Givenchy, many of them unworn or worn only once, realised 3.8 million Swiss francs. Measured against the jewellery totals, a modest commercial event, against the Duchess's annual couture budget of the 1950s and 1960s, a modest return on investment. In September of the same year, on September 11th and 12, 1987, the contents of the Paris villa itself went to auction, realising 21.9 million francs. Louis XIV furniture acquired by the Duke and Duchess across 30 years of careful dealing went to specialist collectors from across Europe and the Americas. Degas and Vuillard paintings that had hung in the reception rooms since Boudin completed his work in the late 1950s were dispersed to buyers whose identities the sale catalogue recorded without further comment. Silver from Asprey, the pieces that had sat on Boudin's meticulously dressed side tables for decades, was catalogued, lotted, and sold to buyers who would place it on other tables in other rooms in other cities, where it would carry no particular story. The villa itself was subsequently leased by Mohammed Al-Fayed, the Egyptian-born British businessman who had acquired Harrods in 1985, and who brought to both acquisitions the same appetite for historically charged addresses and the same confidence that his association with them would confer a kind of institutional validation the British establishment declined to provide through conventional channels. Al-Fayed took the lease on the villa in 1986, undertook a restoration program that preserved substantial elements of Boudin's original decorative scheme, and renamed the property Villa Windsor, a designation the Windsors themselves had never used in life. A museum was his stated intention. The timeline between intention and execution stretched across several decades of planning discussions with the city of Paris. Questions about the preservation of the historic interiors and the various complications introduced by Al-Fayed's own legal and reputational difficulties across the 1990s and 2000s. Eventually, the villa opened to the public as a museum in the summer of 2024, allowing visitors to walk through the rooms where a former King of England had passed his exile and died. The Carrara marble bathroom is there. Bouchonnet's blue florals are there. Boudin's painted ceiling, drawn from the Villa Palagonia in Palermo, is there. Beneath the ground floor, accessible to those who know where to ask, the nuclear fallout shelter waits. What does the entire Windsor story mean, told through its properties? The British royal family spent 35 years paying for the comfortable containment of a former king, whose continued presence in Europe was a constitutional embarrassment, and whose political sympathies were, in the early 1940s, a potential security liability. The £25,000 annual annuity ran from 1937 until the Duke's death in 1972. 35 years of payments, tax-free, drawn from the private arrangements between brothers that the public accounts of the monarchy neither confirmed nor denied. French fiscal arrangements, the nominal lease, the income tax exemption, the access to tax-free goods, were managed through a combination of French governmental goodwill and the practical understanding that a former British king residing comfortably in Paris served French interests as well as British ones. The implicit contract was clear to everyone involved, even if its terms were never written down. Stay in Paris, avoid British politics, return to Britain only by invitation, give no interviews that destabilise the institution, organise nothing, write nothing capable of damaging the crown. In return, the house, the annuity, the parties, the jewels, the couture, the staff, the golf, the pugs and the garden at Gif-sur-Yvette. Comfort, elegance, social visibility, and complete political irrelevance. The Duke of Windsor, across 35 years of exile, kept almost all of his side of the arrangement. No return to Britain was made without invitation. Neither did any campaign for a change of government emerge from the Paris villa. A posture of dignified withdrawal was maintained in public, interrupted by the occasional carefully managed interview that expressed mild regret about the abdication and consistent affection for Wallace, for Britain, and for the institution he had left. His memoir, A King's Story, was circumspect about the most damaging material he possessed. A brother's funeral in 1952 was attended and left without incident. The Duchess of Windsor received, in return for her compliance with a life she had not designed and could not alter, a title that was never the one she had been promised. She received a house she did not own, in a country that was not hers, in an exile she had not requested. Jewellery of extraordinary quality and clothes of extraordinary refinement came with the arrangement, and from the world's press across 5 decades came the sustained and largely uncharitable attention of commentators who had decided, in advance of the evidence, that she was either a manipulative schemer who had destroyed a constitutional monarchy for personal ambition, or a romantic heroine who had inspired the greatest act of love in modern royal history. Neither account was accurate. Both were useful to their respective audiences. What the Sotheby's auction of April 1987 revealed, perhaps more clearly than any biography, was the precise emotional arithmetic of the Windsor exile. Every piece that went under the hammer in Geneva had been given to Wallace by a man expressing, in the most durable material available to him, a conviction that she was worth it. Worth the throne, worth the constitutional crisis, worth the family rupture, worth the diplomatic catastrophe of the German tour, worth the humiliation of Nassau, and worth 35 years of elegant, heavily subsidised irrelevance. The Wittelsbach diamond brooch at 7.92 million Swiss francs. Cartier's Windsor necklace at 4.76 million to Robert Mouawad. Every piece a transaction, and every transaction a form of argument the Duke was still making from beyond the grave. You can walk through the entrance hall at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement now and look up at that painted ceiling. Standing in the room where Edward VIII died on May 28, 1972, 10 days after his niece came to say goodbye, requires no particular imagination. Photographs taken in the garden that afternoon in May are on display in the museum. The Queen, composed, the Duke, dying, the space between them, 36 years wide. The British royal family paid for all of it, and they received exactly what they had paid for. Edward was kept, at considerable expense and with considerable efficiency, away from Britain, away from politics, away from history. Enough comfort was provided to prevent public scandal, and enough isolation was maintained to prevent any restoration of influence. He was, in the language of the institution that managed him across 3.5 decades, handled. The villa is beautiful. Its garden is immaculate. Beneath the ground floor, behind its unannounced door, the nuclear fallout shelter is there if you know to ask. Nobody in the end needed it.